Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Kieran Malooly. I'm the Community and Enterprise Development Worker with Roscommon Leader Partnership, and I am delighted to be here today to moderate this celebration of Irish Rural Link's 30th anniversary. So a very warm welcome to you all. Could you take your seats, please? People at the door, if you could sit down, please. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, it was very disappointing when the first effort to stage this event in December had to be cancelled. You remember it all. We're so happy, however, to finally be able to meet in person today. And it's very fitting that this event is the first large indoor gathering Irish Link has arranged since 2020. Many of you have travelled long distances to be here, and thank you to all those who have made the effort to be here today. Thanks also to the Minister, to Irish Rural Link founders, and all our distinguished guests and speakers here today. And I'd also like to welcome our virtual attendees. I'm told there are 4 cameras to my right, to your left, bringing us onto the World Wide Web. And you are also very welcome to our conference today. A couple of housekeeping rules to begin with. Number 1 was to sit down. Thanks very much, everybody. Number 2, just to let you know with the exit doors, the one you came in, and there are 2 more to my left and to your right at the back of the room. Mobile phones, ladies and gentlemen, I love this one really because it's always a source of great entertainment to me. A little word of warning for you. I'm asking you now to turn off your mobile phone. If it rings, ladies and gentlemen, I will go down to you with a radio mic and ask you to sing a song. This normally works fairly well, but I had a singer at the last conference, and I'd be delighted to go down to see you as well if your phone actually rings and we all hear it today. Ladies and gentlemen, we are going to have an opportunity for you to ask your questions later on. There'll be an opportunity for you to ask your question. I'd ask you to raise your hand, and when the microphone comes to you, if you could identify yourself and your group and speak briefly and to the point, and which means we'll try and get around as many people as possible during the course of the conference itself. Today is a day for celebration, reflection on Irish rural past, and I suppose curiosity about the future too, because at the end of the day, we're looking back on 3 decades. 3-decade period when we saw some of the most radical, revolutionary of changes in our rural life. An era of great change and modernisation. The introduction of new IT that transformed our lives. The development of new infrastructure that ensured some things will never be the same again. And in human terms, I suppose, our children said goodbye to things, didn't they? They said goodbye to mucky fields and schoolyards and chalk and welcomed in an era of astro pitches, 3G and whiteboards. Remember them? We said goodbye to the traffic jams outside Harry's and Kinnegad. Do you remember them? And we flew out at Knock instead to see our cousins in Luton every weekend. We changed our shirts and jerseys in solar-powered spas instead of porta cabins and back seats of Ford Transit vans at the side of the pitch. And we finally pushed that, do you remember, I had one in here, that monstrous Amstrad computer off under the desk, and we used our Apple or our tablet instead to help debate with somebody not in the room but on the other side of the world. We stopped pushing button A and button B, and we focused instead on VoIP instead. And of course, even though it wasn't always changed for the better, we stood up and enjoyed ourselves a wee bit more, didn't we? We saw discos turn into nightclubs and then back again. We put away the flask and the sandwiches from the side of the road. We ate more fast food from something called the Plaza. We turned to air to water. We turned to air to water, didn't we? Or water to water instead of 10 loads of turf every year. We insulated ourselves from the winds of change and watched some turbines appear, where occasionally we never thought they would be. And suddenly, 3 decades were gone. Some said the more things changed, the more things stayed the same. But today we celebrate the reign of Irish rural life with a look back and indeed a look forward to the future. Ladies and gentlemen, to open today's events, I'm delighted to introduce to you our first speaker this morning. Would you please welcome Seamus Boland, the Chief Executive of Irish Rural Link.
Follow that. Thank you very much, Kieran. I'm so pleased that Kieran is here to open this conference. Kieran himself has played no small role in the development of rural stories, rural situations, rural realities, and he's, as he said, on the other side of the microphone, often had to, report on the sad, the joyful, and the happy. And covering the Midlands region, I know he never ignored Irish Rural Link. He included us when we were saying something worthwhile, and sometimes we weren't saying something worthwhile, and he just ignored us as he should. But he's been a great friend of Irish Rural Link, and I'm so delighted that in his new career with Roscommon Partnership, he continues to follow what I think is a love. And the love, in terms of all of us here, is effectively working and fighting for rural Ireland. And I suppose when Irish Rural Link was founded back in 91, we're technically almost 31 years, but let's enjoy that as well. I think the idea was there was something missing. There was something not there. Yes, the very good IFA and ICMSA and all the agricultural organisations were doing a fine job. They were representing their farmers and they were representing the industry of agriculture and farming. But there was still something missing. Founders here like Dermot Levy and John Jodun, Carmel Fox, who couldn't be here, and many others, were setting up small organisations in their own towns and villages because they were living in their own areas and they noticed that people were flying out of them, getting out of them, moving out. The idea was get to secondary school, if you're lucky get a leaving cert, but even if you're not, you're still going. And that was kind of the ambition. And people like the founders of Irish Rural Link, the founders of so many small communities around the country, made a decision, okay, can we do something ourselves? Can we attract enterprise? Can we attract finance? Can we attract services? Can we create jobs? And can we finally give a choice to people who would like to actually live in their own area? And I think the founders of IRL, when they sat about that and set the organisation sort of, as all organisations do, at the beginning in Letterfrack, it was a journey that we all began on. And everybody. And I remember I was in the youth services and I was so impressed by this organisation. I joined it. I never thought I would be so much part of it as life went on. So Irish Rural Link, it is a voice. Not the voice, and it never will be the voice. It is a voice representing rural communities in rural Ireland. That's what it does. That's what it seeks to do. And it wants to bring in to that umbrella so many voices, sometimes opposing voices, sometimes voices in agreement, to try and cover the vast spectrum of life in rural Ireland. Our chairperson, Tara Farrell, this morning on Radio 3 spoke about her own organisation, Longford Women's Link. And it is fascinating to have somebody like that, who is chair of IRL, to speak about the reality for women in rural Ireland. It can be different, and I remember another board member a few years ago, she was quite strong, and she basically said, the land in Ireland is owned by the men of Ireland. I'm afraid the women just have a look in. But anyway, that was her comment. So we have radical voices in Irish Rural Link. We have disagreeing voices in Irish Rural Link, and that's what we should have. We represent the reality that rural Ireland needs to be treated in the same way by successive governments over the years. And in fairness, this is one of the reasons why Heather Humphreys has been so dedicated with the hubs, with the villages and town renewal and the rural regeneration. But we will hear more about that. So it is my pleasure that you have come here this morning to celebrate with us, to meet old friends, to make new friends, to enjoy the discussion, which will reflect back and reflect forward. And we have some interesting speakers that will look at the future as well, because I think we have to look to the future with hope as well. So I understand there's going to be a video now giving a kind of a short resume of Irish Rural Link, and please enjoy, and then I will hand over to Kieran, who will introduce the Minister at that stage. Okay? So thank you for being here. Enjoy the conversations, enjoy each other's company, and get a few people to join us as well. Thank you.
Irish Rural Link represents the interests of community groups in disadvantaged and marginalised rural areas by highlighting problems, advocating appropriate policies and sharing experiences.
Irish Rural Link were really established to be a voice, not the voice, but a voice in advocating for rural communities.
Back in 1991, there was a conference held on a Saturday in Letterfrack, in the Connemara West Centre Letterfrack, looking at the issues and challenges facing rural Ireland. And one of the proposals that came from that conference was that a national body should be formed to campaign vigorously for rural communities.
And prior to that, there was very little, there was nothing much for in rural Ireland. In terms, well, there was the standard organisations like Morecambe, Windsor, IFA, ICMSA, all the other sort of national organisations, but there was very little to look at rural affairs specifically. It was definitely more about policy, certainly in the early years, yeah, it was very much about policy to get governments focused in on the need for social change in rural Ireland.
The agricultural organisations advocate for the person behind the farm gate on the farm, and the Irish Rural Link advocate for the people who are living in the rural communities but not necessarily farming. So the sons and daughters who farm are one side, and the ones who don't farm but live in the area are the other side.
One thing I think was a huge achievement and which helped the organisation in sort of the transition in difficult times was the actually building of a headquarters. So it was a source of income in the difficult times. So that was an achievement. Without that, it might have been much more difficult to survive.
In terms of the mission statement for Irish Rural Link, and if they've changed over the last 30 years, I actually don't think they have. I mean, to influence, inform local, national and European development in favour of rural communities, that's our mission. A shorter way of looking at that is sustainable rural communities. That hasn't changed from the day we were first formed, and it still continues to be the case, because the reality facing rural communities hasn't changed. Depopulation has always been there, lack of job opportunities has always been there, lack of access to services, to health, education, and indeed the way we manage our transport system. So obviously the mission statement to be in favour of rural communities, sustainable rural communities, is a really good one.
Irish Rural Link has grown considerably over the last number of years and is a creative and vibrant organisation that supports community engagement and community advocacy, which are two key pillars of building resilient communities.
The European connections have always been there, and we've always been reaching out to rural type organisations across Europe, and that's essential because the European dimension is big. We have the Common Agricultural Policy, which effectively is the major rural medium of funding. And of course, from our perspective, we need to see that that funding reaches to the wider rural community, as I just said, not just agriculture. So the programs like LEADER and others provide a major part of that. And Irish Rural Link have been or have had a presence in Brussels at influencing level over the years, and that's the way it is. That continues, and I see that as an essential part of what Irish Rural Link do. I suppose looking at our achievements over the last 30 years, I think a couple of things, both structural and positive. We've always said that we are part of a wider set of voices in the rural hinterland. So the achievements are part of all of our success. Obviously, Irish Rural Link strongly supported the idea of a better rural transport programme, and that morphed into different levels. It's now called Local Link. We were there at the very beginning of that, and we really sought to ensure that that particular programme would continue. The other achievement is we put the rural agenda on the government's agenda, and we've continued to do that successfully. And I suppose we also, from a purely practical perspective, brought together a fulcrum where rural organisations, whether they are in Donegal or Kerry or the Midlands or Mayo or wherever, could find a focus point in order to get somebody to represent them. And I think we've managed to do that very well.
I want to sincerely thank Irish Rural Link, who coordinate the training of all ages at all levels in computer training throughout the country, who took me of 1933 vintage to be able to use a laptop.
I believe that Irish Rural Link will continue to grow and to provide meaningful opportunities for rural communities to have their voice heard. And we've seen the impact of the work carried out by Irish Rural Link during the pandemic, particularly the Community Champions initiative, which was a vital resource for rural communities and really showed how rural communities pulled together and showed the resilience of people in supporting each other throughout the pandemic.
Yeah, I guess at the start of the pandemic, I suppose there was a feeling out there that the GA clubs and the rugby club and the soccer clubs were all volunteering to make sure the messages were delivered and the medicine was got out there. But I think Irish Rural Link just saw maybe that there might be some slippage in all that and came up with a scheme called the Community Champions for each county. So I was approached and asked would I be the Community Champion for Clare. And through the network of champions around the country, so much good came out of it.
There is a real opportunity now to foster that spirit of engagement and to have multi-level approaches within our communities that involve a wide range of societal and environmental and economic responses. And community well-being is really essential if we want our communities to fulfil their potential. So we need things like proper funding supports and aggregated data in order for us to be able to do this. And I think it's really important that we have integrated responses from our government departments as well as our communities ourselves. And I think the role of Irish Rural Link is really important there in bringing that grassroots voice to the national level.
The issues that we were campaigning for at the time when we established Irish Rural Link are still the same issues today, except the language has changed.
I think in terms of the challenges and opportunities for rural communities over the next 30 years, they will continue to be based on access to services, employment. They will also be on the way we plan our communities. We're now moving from a situation which we always advocated for, was much more work opportunities at home.
I would like to see Ireland in 2051 with sustainable, engaged, resilient rural communities that have benefited from successful policy implementations, so that we have, for example, fit-for-purpose transport scheme, access to health services, reliable broadband, and enhanced public services that really benefit our rural communities.
Irish Rural Link's role in these is really to challenge, and Irish Rural Link sometimes get very unpopular in challenging norms, even within our rural community. Because our job is not just to identify and advocate on behalf of rural communities to government, whether they're at national, rural or local level. We will do that, we will continue to do that. But our job is also to lead rural communities and to challenge some of the norms that exist in rural communities, because sometimes we think something works very well, but we haven't looked at the alternative. My vision for Irish Rural Link is it continues to stay on the ground with people, understanding the needs of rural areas, understanding what it requires to make it a sustainable rural community. Rural Ireland is a beautiful and lovely place to live in. We just want to make sure that everybody, irrespective of their background, disability or any other infringement, can live there comfortably. And I think that's the vision that I have for Irish Rural Link.
Ladies and gentlemen, our thanks to Seamus and Tara and indeed all the contributors to that video, which I think gave us a marvellous insight into the role of Irish Rural Link over the last 30 years and certainly teed us up nicely for our conference today in terms of looking at the issues going forward. Ladies and gentlemen, we've gathered some of Ireland's most accomplished rural change makers here today, trailblazers in their own rights, policy makers and visionaries. We're very keen to hear what they have to say over the course of the next couple of hours and to hear indeed from yourselves throughout the day. Many of our rural organisations have stands here as well. If you look around the room, on the outside there you can see many of them in position already, and I'd encourage you to visit them during the breaks and to take every advantage possible to speak to them about the rural networking and that can go on here. At this stage, however, I'd like to welcome our next speaker, our special guest this morning, a lady who's been immersed herself in community life in the border counties for many years. Would you please welcome our next speaker, the Minister for Rural and Community Development, Heather Humphreys TD.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. And can I just say, I'm absolutely delighted to be with you here today to celebrate, a little belatedly maybe, but 30 years since the establishment of Irish Rural Link. And I want to say thank you to Tara, thank you to Seamus, and to all the Irish Rural Link team for your kind invitation to open this conference. And can I just say that I'm also joined here this morning by the wonderful staff in the Department of Rural and Community Development, recently Appointment Secretary General Mary Hurley, Assistant Secretary General Fintan O'Brien, and a former Assistant Secretary General who I worked with on many years, William Parnell. So William, delighted to see you back here this morning. So I do believe that this is truly an exciting time for rural Ireland, and I think the theme of today's event, looking back at the past 30 years and also looking forward to the future, is particularly appropriate. I am extremely optimistic about what the future holds. I believe that we're living in a time of transformational potential for rural Ireland, a time when we both have the capacity and the desire to make a real difference in the quality of life for those living in rural communities. The past 30 years have seen a number of milestones in government policy on rural Ireland, starting with the 1999 White Paper on Rural Development and then the 2014 CEDRA report, which called for, amongst other things, the appointment of a senior minister to coordinate rural economic development and the preparation of a specific rural development policy. 2017 saw both of these recommendations come to fruition with the establishment of the Department of Rural and Community Development and the publication of the Action Plan for Rural Development. And all the way along the road, we have been delighted to have had the input, the support and the participation of Irish Rural Link and many others who are invested in the future of rural Ireland. And I have been honoured to lead the department for almost 2 years now, and last year I was delighted to launch Our Rural Future, which is the most ambitious rural development policy to date in this country. Moving into our post-pandemic future, the reopening of society provides the opportunities to reimagine what rural Ireland can be and to bring about a recovery that benefits all parts of the country. Recent years have seen record levels of investment in rural areas, and this is set to continue over the coming years with the commitment of €850 million in capital funding for rural development projects in the National Development Plan up to 2025. And of course, this is in addition to the funding already committed towards digital connectivity, rural mobility and other social and economic supports being developed and delivered across government. We are providing targeted investments in public services, supports aimed at revitalising our towns and villages, empowering our communities and funding to support the development of remote working infrastructure and indeed improved connectivity. Through the delivery of these and other measures outlined in Our Rural Future, we want to see more people living, working and raising their families in vibrant rural communities. And I'm pleased to say work is continuing apace on the implementation of the policy in 2022. We have published the new regional enterprise plans. New technological universities are being established in the west and the south east of the country, and a new €50 million fund to improve wastewater services in rural communities has recently been announced. We continue to grow and expand our national network of remote working hubs, connected hubs, and already over 230 hubs are on the network, and we are on course to meet our target of 400 hubs countrywide, which is well ahead of 2025. We have published a new Town Centre First policy, which is designed to tackle the scourge of dereliction in our rural towns and villages, and at a time when the housing need in this country has never been greater. We need to put a non-relenting focus on bringing vacant properties in our towns and villages back into use, because bringing people into our towns will revitalise them. I'm working with my colleague, Minister Darragh O'Brien, on the delivery of the Croí Cónaithe Fund, which will support and incentivise the refurbishment of properties in rural towns and villages for residential use. And separately, in my own department, I intend to announce details shortly of a new funding stream for the acquisition of vacant properties, such as former bank buildings, so that they can be taken into public ownership and converted for community use. Only last week I was in Kinnity in County Offaly to officially open the new Slieve Bloom mountain bike trail, and that's a €10 million investment supported by my department. Over 500 mountain bikers descended on that rural village over a weekend, and it has given a huge spin-off in terms of the local businesses in the area. And later this year I will launch Ireland's first ever National Outdoor Recreation Strategy that will place a huge focus on how we can utilise our natural amenities, our mountains, our lakes, our forests, to attract visitors to rural communities. And that strategy will help to exploit the huge untapped tourism potential of our inland counties in particular. Rural counties like Offaly, like Roscommon, like Monaghan, and indeed Longford, and I'm delighted that Senator Micheál Carrigy is here this morning as well. Inland counties like that, we don't have the dramatic coastlines and the beaches of the other high-profile tourism counties, but we have our own unique assets, and we need to tap into those as well. So work is underway on the major redevelopment of the National Famine Museum in Strokestown. Later this year, work will commence on the long-awaited restoration of the Ulster Canal in Monaghan, and the continued development of the Royal Canal Greenways opens up huge opportunities for counties like Westmeath and Longford. So those projects mean more footfall in rural towns and villages, and it means that the little coffee shop or the small business can open up and give them an opportunity. So I have visited every county since I became Minister for Rural and Community Development, and there really are brilliant, unique projects like these happening in communities all across the country. And in fact, I think I'm going to start now on my second tour of all the counties of Ireland. And when I finish a rural roadshow, as I call it, where I get to visit and get to meet communities, I get into the car and I go off and I say to myself, you know, I have a great job. I genuinely love every minute that I spend out there talking to people and getting the opportunity to say thank you to the volunteers, because what we are doing in government is helping you realise your vision for your community. Because I know what they want in Ahabog and County Monaghan, but I might know what they need in Kinnity, or I might know what I definitely won't know what they need in other locations. But you, the local people and the local communities, you will know what you need, and we are here to help you realise your ambition, and that is what it's about. But we also need to help people, and we need to shout it from the rooftops, our successes. Be proud of what we have achieved, and by showcasing best practice, it sends out the message to communities: if they can do it, so can we, because a little bit of competition never does any harm. And when you see something good happening in a community, you say, why can't we do that? So, and that's to encourage people. So, and that's what our rural future is all about. It's about the ground-up approach to rural development. It is not top-down, it's from the bottom up. And on that note, I think it's important to acknowledge today the importance of the dialogue and engagement to the success of our rural future. The policy was informed by extensive consultation with stakeholders and the public, and we are very grateful to receive the valuable contributions of Irish Rural Link in the development of the policy. As an organisation, Irish Rural Link has always been a champion when it comes to issues affecting rural Ireland, and is a key partner for my department. And as we move forward in implementing our rural future, it is important now that we do not shut up shop in terms of our engagement with stakeholders. Our rural future is intended to be a living document that evolves over time. So we will continue to engage with the people and the organisations working in rural areas as we implement this policy. We know that circumstances change over time, and we're determined to respond to those changes. So just look at all the changes we have had since COVID came here. We've had to think outside the box, and we need to change. So we need to keep changing our rural future as the environment in which we live in changes. So we know that, as I said, we know that things change, and we need to respond to those changes. And you know, I think we never saw as much, and we found such a new appreciation for those of us living in rural areas of what we had on our doorstep. There really is, you know, we discovered things we didn't know we had. So when we were restricted to the 5 kilometre travel, those of us who live in rural areas, we were fortunate to have the fields, the bogs, the forests and the walkways that some of us didn't know were there. So if you wanted to go for a nice walk, we could step out our front door in rural Ireland. People in the cities didn't have that, and I think it caused a lot to reflect on what really is important in life. Remote working has seen more young people and families making the move back to their communities. There's a better quality of life in rural Ireland, and people want to grasp it. The tired narrative of rural Ireland is dying, and I don't want to hear that. It is not dying. We have flipped that on its head, and it is not coming back. Rural Ireland is alive, and it's kicking in communities across this country. And yes, there are challenges, and there always will be challenges. But it's by working together, listening and engaging through forums like this that we will overcome those challenges and make our rural communities stronger and vibrant places to live, work and raise a family. And when I think of rural communities, I think of the tidy towns, I think of the community council, I think of the development association and all those people that are working on the ground. And can I just say on behalf of government, thank you. And thank you to those that help to empower communities, that give them the advice they need and sit down and help them fill up those forms, because in government we could not do our work without all of you working to help us do and achieve what we want for rural Ireland. So with that, I want to thank you again for inviting me to open this event. I would like to congratulate Irish Rural Link for the key role that they have played in rural development policy over the last 30 years. I got to know Seamus Boland when I became Minister in 2014 for Arts, Heritage and the Gaeltacht. And I just want to thank Seamus for all his good advice, for his very sensible and calm approach. And you know, it's always solution driven with Seamus, and his patience. He's very patient. You know, he brings a huge wealth of knowledge to the job that he does. And I really do want to say a big thank you to you, Seamus. So I want to wish you all the very best with today's discussions. I look forward to your continued support as we implement our rural future and look ahead to the next 30 years in rural Ireland, full of hope, full of confidence and full of ambition. And when we educate our young people, we want them back in our communities, and we want them back with good quality jobs. And we can do that because for too long we said goodbye to them and they never came back. But that opportunity is there now, and we want to hold on to it, and we'll all work together to make sure it stays with us. Thank you very much. Go Mila Mahagib.
Thank you very much, Minister, for your talk this morning, your fighting talk this morning, and giving the message and inspiration to all of the groups around the room here. Thanks also for reminding me earlier where I was 30 years ago when this all started, courting in Monaghan town in a hotel which we're glad to say is still there, still thriving, the West End Hotel. They were the days. I know the Minister has a commitment to radio very shortly, but ladies and gentlemen, certainly no one in 1991 could have predicted the upheaval of the last 2 years and the pandemic I know that Irish Rural Link is very proud of its community champion response at that time and wish to mark their efforts here today. In a moment, we're going to have an opportunity to meet just 6 of our community champions who've come from all corners of the country, including someone just in from Kerry this morning. But before we meet them and make a little presentation to them, I'd like to call on Seamus to come forward again for a moment and just explain to you the nature of the terrific work carried out by the Community Champion Response Team.
Thank you, Kieran. The Community Champions, along with the Wheel, we managed to bring forward a novel approach of reaching, as Anthony Daly said in the film, every single person. And the idea, it actually came about some years ago when myself and Deirdre Garvey went to the department then in Energy and Communications when we looked, remember the old digital TV, or not the digital, it's now digital, but the old, whatever you call it, I can't even remember. And the whole idea is we were changing the signal to become digital. And there was dire warnings from some rural areas that this would cause all sorts of calamities and everything, when in fact it modernised the whole system. And we devised a system whereby every single person, especially in the more lower income and vulnerable households, people living alone, would actually get the help and support in order to make the change. And I think the idea was, don't have strangers coming to people's houses, have people who know them. And the community champion was one person, or sometimes 2 in the larger counties, would coordinate the kind of community volunteerism that's already there in the GA clubs, in the women's clubs, in all sorts of clubs. And they would come forward and they would literally take it road by road. And they would say, you know what? And I became a volunteer myself at one stage. And the very funny thing was, I don't think the people I visited even knew it was Irish Rural Link or the Wheel that were behind it, but it didn't matter. The point is, I done my share of the houses. I said, look, do you want to do this, and this is how to do it. So we brought it to the pandemic. They were extremely active, and I think, as many of the community champions said afterwards, what they discovered was not just the fact that people needed help, but people needed company. They needed to talk. They needed well-being. So that's the Community Champions programme. So James or Kieran, I'll now ask you to do the necessary, and the Minister will present some awards. Thank you, and thank you to the champions for what you've done.
Yes, indeed, ladies and gentlemen, they were the unsung heroes who inspired people to do very special things, inspired, I suppose, ordinary people to do very extraordinary things during COVID, during that terrible period, and helped where it was needed. I'm delighted to welcome 6 of the champions to the stage today to receive a small token of appreciation. I'd like to call firstly on Steve Dolan from County Galway, our champion from County Galway. Congratulations to Steve. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our next champion from Galway City, Brendan Mullery. Congratulations to Brendan, ladies and gentlemen. I'm not sure whether he flew up or whether he drove. Would you please welcome, all the way from County Kerry, our champion, Dave Fitzgibbon. Well done, Dave. We're going across the Midlands for our next recipient of the award for his work as an inspiring champion during the pandemic. Please welcome Paddy Buggy from County Laois. Well done, Paddy. Congratulations to you. And ladies and gentlemen, inspiring the team in Cavan throughout the pandemic, please welcome Vanessa Clark, our champion for County Cavan. Well done, Vanessa. Ladies and gentlemen, all of our team worked with it. A team of volunteers on the ground and inspired people to help where help was needed during the pandemic. Last but by no means least this morning, the local champion. Please welcome Niamh Nolan from County Roscommon. Well done, Niamh, and indeed, ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together for our champions. Our thanks to everybody for being with us this morning. Ladies and gentlemen, at this stage, I know the Minister is going to a radio interview. You'll have a chance just for 5 or 6 minutes for a comfort break, and we will bring you back with our star-packed panel in about 6 or 7 minutes to start the conference. Thank you very much. Yeah, exactly. You're first up, aren't you? James looking after you, isn't he? could take your seats, please, ladies and gentlemen, we're about to commence. Take your seats, please. Thank you. The panel are going to respond. We'll have to have something with the PA system as well. Yeah. So there's one to end it, maybe. Yes, indeed. Thank you. So, ladies and gentlemen, we come to the main business, I suppose, of this morning. We have two one-hour sessions coming up. We have a one-hour panel starting just now. And in this forthcoming 60 minutes or so, we're looking at how rural Ireland has changed over the past 30 years, the challenges met, and the lessons to be learned. A couple of lessons for you around the room. As I said at the beginning, please ensure your mobile phones are off. If they ring, you'll be coming to the stage to sing a song, I guarantee you. Secondly, as I say, if you could, when you get an opportunity, there will be an opportunity to ask a question. If you identify yourself, your name and your organisation, you'll have one question and hand on the microphone. We'll get as many in as possible when we get there. But first, let me introduce our panel, ladies and gentlemen. In a few moments, we're going to hear from our guest speaker in the first section. But before that, I want to introduce the panel on the stage. You know already Seamus Boland on my extreme left, on your right, as you look to the stage. Seamus Boland from Irish Rural Link, down all the days, deeply involved in the organisation and its progress and steering it all those years. Beside Seamus Moore, of course, Pat McDonough, no stranger to you either, from Kiltulla in County Galway, Managing Director of the Supermax Group. And next to Pat this morning, Mairead Lavery, a face and a voice you know as well for over 20 years of experience as a journalist and editor with the Irish Farmers Journal, and involved in so many events and organisations down through the years. You know her particularly well, I'm sure. And next, of course, is Tara Farrell here from Irish Rural Link. You've heard Tara already on tape this morning on video, and you know her contribution, which is so central to the progress of this organisation. But ladies and gentlemen, to tee it up, I suppose, and to start our debate in the last 30 years, I want to introduce you to our first speaker this morning, who will have a few more minutes than the rest of our panel to give you a little flashback. Rural change since 1991, it says on your PowerPoint. Conor Skehan is a lecturer at DIT School of Spatial Planning and Transport Engineering, a chartered architect, impact assessor, landscape architect, planner, former head of DIT's Department of Environment and Planning, and of course, former director of Board Namona, former chairman of the Peatlands Council. He'll be known to you from his profile in the media, but his profile in rural development and development in general. He's going to speak to you firstly, and then we'll hear from our panel. Would you please welcome Conor Skehan?
Thanks for the welcome. Lovely to be here. Lovely to see so many familiar faces from so many of my past lives and past sins. The introduction says I'm going to talk about change. I'm not going to give you a history lesson. Mairead very interestingly was saying at the beginning that I was saying I'm going to throw out a few questions, and she was saying, sure, what questions could there be about the past? We all know that. Well, one of the things I'm going to try and do is maybe change how you look at the past, and maybe ask ourselves, are the things that we thought were true about our past, our recent past, are they actually still true? Were they ever true? And are they a basis for us going forward? I'm talking to you mainly today about the future, about moving forward, but I'm trying not to steal the thunder of people who are going to talk about that in the second part. So I'm trying to tee you up for that. So I'm going to begin by talking about a few of the facts and myths. I'm going to try and impress upon you a thing which is an opinion, and that's all it is, that I've formed over pretty much my whole career now, working at rural issues the length and breadth of the country, which is the great lie of the word rural Ireland. I have formed a view, for want of a better word, that there's no such thing. There are rural Irelands, plural, and that the sector self-harms every day of the week when it goes out and uses the word rural Ireland. So I'm going to talk about that with, I hope, not too much passion, but it's a very deeply held belief. I'm going to talk about a series of emerging issues, and the emerging issues are opinions. We live in a world where facts and opinions get mixed up a lot. And facts don't change. They're called hard facts for exactly that reason. They'll graze your knees if you trip on them. But opinions are much more malleable. They're much more prone to change. And in the world that we live in today, particularly the world of social media, opinions can become weapons incredibly quickly, used for division and creating unhappiness among people, creating anxiety. And the division I spoke about, the tribalism, is one of the things that can do such harm to things like all of the work that's so dear to your hearts, where people at a sweep can make generalisations about rural this and rural that, or indeed about urban this and urban that. So I want to talk a little bit about that. And then I'm going to end, as I often do, by cheekily saying, if it was up to me, if Seamus Boland fell off the stage there and had to be replaced, what I would be looking at. Long life and good health to Seamus, but it's a good thought experiment. All right, so I'm just going to start off a little bit by looking at some actual facts that surprised me even when I was looking them up, and maybe a few myths as well. And before I do that, I'm going to go way back before 1991, which is meant to be my survey year, to look at this. This is a map of the location and density of people in Ireland. And it's one of the most profound and, to me, saddest documents I've ever seen. The population of Ireland in 1841, the 8 million people we had. Many people are shocked to realise not only do we have those 8 million, but where they were, and more importantly, where they are not today. And of those 8 million, a tiny fraction of them lived in what we would now call East Leinster or Dublin. More of them actually lived in Cork than in Dublin at that stage. And the extraordinary hollowing out that took place between the 1840s and the 1930s to result in the country that we see today and we're familiar with. The important sort of fact to bear in mind, which we tend to be unaware of in Ireland, is that we're still the only country in Europe that has less people now than we had in the 1840s. Shocking fact. It's a shocking fact. And it's one of the things that we have to keep reminding ourselves. And I'm going to show you 3 other slides like this to remind you about the fact that we're different. Now, everybody, usually adolescent children, spend a lot of their time telling their parents, I'm different, right? And I'm different is usually a special pleading that can be rightly ignored. But in this particular case, it is important for us to realise that we are different, and we will remain different for the foreseeable future. And I think it's a thing that we need to internalise for ourselves and be unashamed to say to other people when they're asking us to be the same as somebody in Denmark or Italy or Greece, that we are different and we have had a different arc of history underneath us, and it allows and indeed requires us to make different demands of ourselves and of those people who we work with throughout Europe. The first is this one here, which is the changing amount of rural and urban people in Ireland. This surprises a lot of people for one very simple reason, which is that a lot of the narrative around rural Ireland uses the word decline and contraction. The reality is the number of people living in rural Ireland hasn't changed much at all. What has changed is that the urban population has dramatically increased. So that's a very important starting point, and perhaps a removal of a treasured myth from your vocabulary, but it is very important to understand that truth. It's true today. It's been true since, it's very interesting, 1972, 73, where the switchover happened, where we started to have more urban dwellers than rural dwellers. And what's really amazing is today, we have about 2/3 of our population in urban areas and 1/3 in rural areas. And what's interesting about that is that's the exact opposite of the proportion at the foundation of the state. At the foundation of the state that we're celebrating this year, 2/3 of us were rural and only 1/3 were urban. So it is important for us to keep a sort of a track on our actual identity and make sure that our actual identity isn't at variance with reality. Another interesting thing is to see that in a context, and this context here shows the same figures of urban versus rural throughout the EU. And the EU is indeed a highly urbanised place, and what's more important is that the proportion of people in rural areas is declining, and that split has been going on for at least 3 and up to 6 generations in some places. So we, a rural country, live in a highly urbanised continent that have different sets of views and values from ours, and that they have very deep roots. And then the last context setter is to see that in the grandiose, if you want to call it that, context of the whole world, where the whole world is also urbanising. And the reason I draw attention to that particular one is to use the word normal, that a transition from a rural economy, from a rural society to an urban one, is the same everywhere in the world. I'm either fortunate or misfortunate enough to have been to a lot of places throughout the world with the United Nations dealing with areas after disasters and conflicts. And in the most remote places in the world, I sit down with people in the local village and I hear a set of conversations that you could have in anywhere, in the west of Ireland in particular. The people are saying, if only you'd been here 2 weeks ago for the festival, all the young people were back. We lost our post office. The bus doesn't come here anymore. It's not worth anyone's while farming the rice or the sheep or the goats or whatever it is. Sure, there's much more money to be made in the town. And if it weren't for the funny clothes and the funny accents, it could be in Mayo, it could be in West Kerry. Nothing is new under the sun. This is happening everywhere in the world, and it's been going on for 150 years as cash and a cash-based economy took hold. So I'm not saying it's a good thing. Many people all over the world feel unhappy about it. But almost every country I visit in the world has a department and a ministry of rural development trying to get balanced regional development. Again, I'm not saying it's good or bad, but what I will tell you this is if there was a solution to it, it would have been found, and it's not for want of countries the length and breadth of the world having the same conversations that we're having here. We're not special, but neither is anybody else. So it's an important and maybe slightly sombre context to put on the work you're doing here, and that we need to put those kinds of facts in front of us as a context. And then lastly, to look at the urbanisation itself and to realise that within that urbanisation, Ireland has both come very late to the party of urbanisation and very little. We remain a relatively unurbanised country at the moment within the context of our peers, not just in Europe, but throughout the world. So that's one of the things to bear in mind. And secondly, at the risk of encroaching on the second part of this morning, all of the indications are that that will continue out into the future, that Ireland will continue to be a country where a very substantial proportion of the population, about a quarter, will be people who have rural identities and rural lives. So this is not going away, and it's not changing, and it's not declining, or any of those words you might want to use. It is here to stay, and it's an integral part of who we are, and has to be an integral part of the governance and the policies of this country for the foreseeable future. So that's also a very important context. And I'm saying these things to give you challenges. And the challenges are, if we're going to still be in this room in 25 years' time, hopefully to God we'll be different people in the room, but they will have very different demands and very different questions. And what we're really here today about is that this particular occasion occurs on a kind of a tipping point between a period when Seamus and his colleagues embarked on something during a period of great economic challenge and great neglect of rural areas, and in my opinion that period of neglect has firmly ended and we're on a different trajectory now, and we need to have different challenges for ourselves. And in my opinion those challenges are going to be about defining and articulating success. And success is no longer going to be measured in things like stopping decline. It's going to be about having active, positive, forward-looking, attractive scenarios for ourselves, and more importantly, for both your children and all the people who will want to co-locate and co-live with your children as they realise there are new qualities of life available to them, particularly in rural areas. So that's the kind of context setter I'm trying to give you for that. To go back to the point of Seamus and his work at the beginning, this is a map of Irish unemployment that starts off in 1991, and you can see the shocking levels of unemployment that existed at that time. And the unemployment was a scourge everywhere in Ireland, and the scourge was particularly acute where it coincided with areas with early school leaving and low educational attainment, which cut people off from the future or tempted them to get on the boat or get on the plane to go to Boston or London, or to go down and work in the local engineering works where there was an immediate prospect of getting a car by the time you were 17 because you'd have a cash salary and no reason to stay in education. A lot of harm, a lot of structural harm was done at a very local level, and frankly a lot of governmental harm had been done in the 10 years before that, where a series of poor decisions were made, both in terms of policy and economic policy. And you can see the very steep fall then that occurred as we started to get our act together and enter periods that were called Celtic Tigers and all kinds of other things, and the remarkable success story we are now in Europe today, with blips. And the blips, I think, is probably one of the most important things to bear in mind, is that when we have, as we do, one of the most open economies in the world, that those open economies are particularly, they're acutely vulnerable to fairly large ups and downs caused by international swings in the market. On a personal note, because in my professional work I deal with inward investment for large industrial projects and things like that, I think that we are particularly blessed at the moment. We're in an increasingly volatile world, and many of the arrows, so to speak, are pointing in the wrong direction for things like inflation and interest rates and economic activity. But we're going to end up as this peculiar little bubble of being people who are in the EU, who are English speaking, who have a strong tradition of being open and accommodating, and I think we will end up being one of those people. Maybe even we won't have achieved all that much, we just won't have made the same mistake as other people. So I think that we will not be looking forward to the same kind of dramatic peaking again of unemployment that we saw back at the time when Irish Rural Links was established. And then just a few other reminders of some of the big things that have happened during that period. This is a peculiar representation of Irish population shown as peaks, where there's the most people. And we are living in a country where increasingly the centre of gravity is in East Leinster. I am forever, in all the work I do, describe it as East Leinster. We do ourselves harm every day of the week when we talk about Dublin. This is not a Dublin versus the rest issue. This is East Leinster. East Leinster already contains just under 2/3 of the entire country's population. And that is a reality that isn't going to change anytime soon. If anything, it's going to intensify, and I don't have to tell those of you who are citizens of County Laois that you're living in by far the fastest growing county in Ireland, and that's a reality that's not going to go away. I spent all day yesterday up in Farmley House with all the planners of the country, and they are making plans for a new planning system that continues to try and squeeze us into shoes that are the wrong size by having visions as to where people should live, as opposed to being open to accommodating where people do live and where people want to live. So we have a lot of problems to deal with that. But we have had successes. We are now a different country in the sense that the distance between those places, as measured both in kilometres but more important in terms of time, has changed. And one of the unsung victories, if you want to call it that, since 1991 was putting in place both our motorway system and our national primary system. And we now live in a connected country where there are the opportunities for the majority of the number of people, but not the majority of areas, to be able to be readily connected to international airports. And the map in the middle there shows the distance and the level of service that people have, both to motorway access and to an international airport. The theme I will end with when I'm doing my, if it were up to me, is I will draw attention to things that are unfinished business. So while I'm praising the connectivity and praising the opportunities that have been created, I'm also admitting and drawing your attention to the fact that this is unfinished business. The connectivity is a very important one. When I take my students on their rural planning seminar, we go away for a week, and recently we had to finish just outside Ennis, and one of the students pretty inconsiderately announced that she had to be in Dublin Airport for a particular flight, which she hadn't told any of us about. And from the outskirts of Ennis to the entrance to Dublin Airport, we met a single traffic light. One traffic light. That was pretty impressive. Driver turned south, went under the tunnel and came back up. And we're living in an extraordinary country now where those kinds of things that were huge half-day trips are now 2 hours. So the 2-hour rule for where most of us can get to most of the time are one of the most important things in terms of access to equality of opportunity. Not complete equality, but equality of opportunity. So I think that one of those things it's done is it's changed and shrunk our perception of what's the edge and what's the middle. And it is one of the big unsung and underappreciated achievements. Now, somebody said to me, and the founder of Supermax wouldn't be a million miles away from me here, that all roads go both ways. And the road is as likely to take your customer down to the outskirts of Dublin to buy their white goods as they are to bring them into your city or town to buy their fridge there. So it's a double-edged sword, and we are seeing it, for instance, in places like Clare. We do a lot of work on tourism with Fáilte Ireland, and the typical trip to the Cliffs of Moher now is a day trip from a Dublin hotel. People get in the bus in the morning, they're gone in the evening. So a lot of our fundamental understandings about what we're trying to do with things like tourism, for instance, have been turned on their head. And bringing more and more tourists to the west of Ireland is not going to bring more and more overnight stays, is not going to bring more and more expenditure to those areas, because the very thing, the gift it gives, the motorway also takes away. So there's a whole lot of new perceptions, a lot of new realities that have to be taken on board and have become part of our thinking. So, just two more sets of points to make. One of them is this, the many Irelands. And my friends and family all tease me about going on about this too much, so I'm only going to do it for one slide so as not to overburden you. And the basic message is that we have, at the very least, 3 rural Irelands, plural. And there's lots of different ways people have of mapping it in terms of rural typologies, in terms of measuring remoteness. But the main message that I want to give out of it is that one size does not fit all. And anyone who walks in the door of your office talking about a rural policy for anything, if they're using the singular word, show them the door as fast as you can and tell them to come back when they've got something that's better fitted to your needs. In my opinion, or in my family rant, I recognise 3. There is certainly areas of extreme peripherality in Ireland. There's no getting away from that. But there is also the location of that. Right. The location of where the majority live, which is, I call, the 90%. So we need to start making and implementing policies that recognise that the majority of rural Ireland have a very different set of circumstances from what pertains down in Southwest Kerry, for instance. I pick on Southwest Kerry because that's where my family have been since Adam was a lad, and I am under no illusions that what happens when you're a young woman suffering a miscarriage down in the depths of South Kerry and you're in danger of bleeding to death on your way to a hospital. I am never under any doubt about the real blood and guts cost of peripherality. So not for a moment do I take that for granted and the hardships that go with it. But once you take that off the table and recognise that for the 90% for rural Ireland, there are a very different set of options, a very different set of opportunities, and those options and opportunities are only getting better, not worse. And then finally, there is a third layer within that, which are those big peri-urban areas where very large numbers of people, and it's a numbers game, very large numbers of people live with very immediate access for education and for services and everything from retail to entertainment to major city clusters that exist. So the argument, the case I'm making to you all is different. These are different places, and the sooner we start to articulate, admit and relish the differences, the sooner we will make progress, and that those differences are just that, they're just different. Not better, not worse, just different. And I think of it as an analogy for those of you who are lucky to have kids with your own family. You love your kids equally, differently. Some of them can be difficult, but you love them all, but they're different. And that's what a good country should be. It should be able to accommodate and foster those differences, give them all the same opportunities, but at the same time accept that they will have different trajectories as they go through life. And then in the last one, just to look at the fact that we are dealing with a world where
as I said at the beginning, a world of opinions. And in that world of opinions, opinions that are held by people who neither live in, live off, or live beside the land that you all own, work in, have been born in and grown up in, these people increasingly have strongly held opinions about how your world, how your land should be conducted. I neither have the time nor the inclination, frankly, or as a cruel friend of mine said, nor do I have the crayons, to explain the naivete of some of these opinions, but they are realities that impinge on every one of your lives every day of the week. So these are opinions about the priority that should be given to all of these different issues. And I speak with the scars on my back and many friends I made in this room during that period as chairman of the Peatlands Council, where I travelled the length and breadth of the Irish Midlands, meeting community after community after community who were suffering under the lash of ecological legislation and implementation that had not been properly thought out by the people who were given the job of caring for these really important groups of highly responsible people who found themselves criminalised. And they're the words that were used by the High Court judge that I got to examine the issue. They were criminalised through no fault of their own. So those kinds of issues, we've got to wake up to the very great harm, the very great changes that can be brought about by the opinions of people who don't have the responsibility with living with the consequences of them. All of you, and I say it every day of the week in terms of my work providing planning advice to people, water protection is the next thing. The River Basin Management Plan and water protection legislation is going to put the Habitats Directive into the halfpenny place as a constrainer on development in rural areas and rural lives. And you all have to wake up to it. You all have to participate in it. You all have got to make sure that people are not making plans for your areas that you have not been part of. They're difficult, they're technical, it's long and drawn out, but you must participate. You must actively go and seek out people who are making river basin management plans for your area, for your parish, and participate and be heard in that. Everybody is advocating the extraordinary success of the new residents in many rural areas, particularly in peripheral areas as a result of COVID, where people have made decisions to work from home, and that allows them to work in and populate new areas. It's a wonderful thing pro tem. It's a wonderful thing at the moment. But I've seen too often in too many parts of the country the underestimation of the fact that these new residents will have new demands, new energies, and will have new value systems. And I warn people in my development work that if you want to see trouble, show me your newest, nearest neighbour. And I foresee a great volatility happening as new sets of demands and new expectations fan out across many parts of rural Ireland, and complacent county managers and complacent county planners and complacent environmental protection officers the length and breadth of the country are about to get a rude awakening with the type of people who are going to start emailing them and knocking on their doors. We see the other more specific ones of things like wind energy and the extraordinary either opportunities or conflicts it can create in a local area, and they're driven by opinions as to what should or shouldn't be the right thing to do, and as to whether the character of people who either support or oppose those things are deemed to be moral or otherwise. And then finally, all of this takes place in the extraordinary cauldron of social media and the way that social media drives and can sometimes animate and sometimes poison debates that might otherwise have taken place face-to-face in a healthier way. So we have this challenge that every place, there is only one place, but increasingly those places are felt to be owned and controlled by many people who neither live there and live off it, nor take responsibility for their decisions. And this is one of the things that we're going to have to find a way to become more articulate about and, if necessary, push back against. And then finally, just very briefly, to remind all of us that progress is being made. I mean, I picked up this document and read it and found myself almost amazed on every page at the right-headedness of it, of the comprehensiveness of it, of the sensibleness of identifying what the real areas were, of the fact that it appears to be a document that was built on listening and experience and realism. So I'm just saying, as from an external point of view, I can't commend enough the current suite of government policies that we're moving forward with. There are, and always will be, unfinished business of things that we need to do. And my list, for what it's worth, and I'm finishing with this slide, is just to do these things that I've asked you already, which is to define the different rurals and to have clear, accurate, realistic policies and implementation plans for the different types of rural Ireland that we have.
I think we need to have very clear models for each of those as to what we mean by rural services and an integrated delivery of rural services by the full suite of government agencies, but that extraordinary need for high coordination that only exists in rural areas, be they peripheral or central, that has got to be recognised. And then you can see me beginning to differentiate out into what I would regard as the peripherals and the working countrysides. In a lot of my work, I do plans for counties. I do landscape character assessments, county development plans. And one of the most useful things I have found to do is to take the countryside and break it brutally into those two simplistic combinations, a heritage countryside and a working countryside. And a working countryside is where there's an assumption that people are going to live their lives, build their houses, develop their enterprises, keep their cattle, grow forests, do things we've never thought about before, and that's what they are for. Purposeful planning, that's what they are for. And then there are certainly places that are heritage countryside, and they're not just ours, they're the heritage of all of Europe. And there's different sets of issues taking place there, not necessarily meaning that things can't happen there, but what does happen there happens more carefully and sometimes happens more slowly. And as I say, I'm just passing that tool, that knife onto you that I've found very useful in cutting the Occam's razor for rural development of heritage countrysides and our working countrysides. And of the points within those two types of countrysides, the integration, I can't speak enough about the importance of doing it. As I said, my family down southwest Kerry, places where there's extraordinary poverty and extraordinary exclusion, and the importance of making sure that every single solitary euro and every single hour of public service money and time is expended to get the maximum impact for those people who need it most. And also in those areas where ageing is a big issue, rather than being in denial about the ageing, to work with the ageing, to work with, in some cases, population losses, and instead of going out every day to face defeat by seeing it continue to happen, to anticipate it and work with it and make for planned transitions in those areas. And then similarly, in our working countryside, to begin most fundamentally of all with transport. That transport is even more important than housing as a fundamental right, rural transport, and that massive amounts of money and attention and time have got to go into this issue. We've begun with our rural links, certainly, but so much work to still do on that. When I came back to Ireland in 1981, I was asked to address the National Housing Conference, all the planners and architects and developers in Ireland. And at the National Housing Conference, I was given the title, and it was called The Village as an Alternative to Urban Sprawl. And I was supposed to stand up and say people were very silly not to live in villages, that they were a wonderful alternative. They were not, and still are not, because we have not made the kinds of investments, the types of commitments to those villages that are necessary for them to become not just viable, but attractive alternatives to living elsewhere. So there's too much talking about how people should nucleate without making any allowance at all for spending to make sure they're a place that people want to nucleate towards. And all of that leads us to the final point of having purposeful planning for a working countryside. We still regard a new house or a new quarry or a new power line or a new wind farm in the country as being an unnatural thing. If a planner sees it as a failure, where in the name of God are you going to put a quarry except in the countryside? It's a completely normal part of the countryside. Where else is a motorway or a power line going to go except through the countryside? It's where they belong. And we need to start making plans where the majority of the county is not the white lands where anything goes, but they're places that are for particular purposes, including areas that are for rural living. That's what they're for. That's what their purpose is. And unless and until we start to take those kinds of steps, we're not going to go anywhere. Sin Bhfuil, a Cordia Gael. I'm sorry for the microphone issue.
Thank you very much, Conor. Thought-provoking, controversial. Lots of other things I could use. Get us going. Nice start for us morning. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to hear from our panel briefly. They'll have a couple of minutes, 3 minutes each. I think firstly give them a chance to respond to what you just heard as well. In fairness, lots of facts that have gone up on the board. So I'll start with you, Braid. I mean, Shane says nothing has changed really here. 2/3 urban, 1/3 rural. Nothing has changed, or going to change. But has farming changed in the last 31?
Yeah, farming has changed a lot. Farming has changed a lot. But one of the things that kind of really interests me is that a new report by the European Parliament's Agri Committee, based on going back to 2003 and looking forward, has found that Ireland is the only country, the only region, where farm numbers are actually on the increase, 3% increase. And they don't see any reason for that to change between now and 2040. So from the farming perspective, the numbers seem to be there. From a Farmers Journal perspective, we've the highest readership ever. So they're not buying it in leafy Blackrock, they're buying it out in rural Ireland or different parts of rural Ireland, and it shows there's a strong agricultural community there today.
Thank you very much. Tara, just beside you, I mean, Conor did mention one woman in Kerry. It was a bit scary hearing it again. But from your perspective, I suppose, has the role of women changed in rural Ireland since 1991?
I think it has, and very much for the better. And when we think back to, listening to your introduction earlier on about the memories of 1991, I was still in school in 1991. It feels like 5 minutes ago, but obviously not. And we were, I suppose, celebrating in the aftermath of the first female Irish President, Mary Robinson, who really blazed a trail and I think sent quite a lot of political shockwaves through the system, which we felt as budding young feminists that was no bad thing. Ireland was not particularly progressive for women in the early 90s, as we know. When we think about things like family planning, reproductive health care, marital rape was not outlawed in 1990, and the last Magdalen Laundry did not close till 1996. And those issues have had huge impacts on rural communities right up to this day. So I think we've seen quite a lot of progression. We have quite a lot of new strategies coming in place. Our rural future, we also implement domestic violence strategy. But, and this is, I suppose, something that Longford Women's Link is very strongly advocating around, is the issue of domestic violence, which is still very, very prevalent. We had 450 women and children who accessed our services last year in Longford, and that's a rural county. That is unacceptable in 2021. Really, really unacceptable. And as I said, while there is a lot of progress, there's still an awful lot more to be done in terms of ensuring that we are building societies that are not supporting or in any way defending or cloaking those who are perpetrating that kind of violence. So there have been some changes, but not enough.
A lot of important stuff. You pass the mic down perhaps for a moment. The road goes both ways. That's what Conor said. The road goes both ways. Pat McDonough, apart from your obvious business connections, what are your thoughts about the last 30 years in terms of rural enterprise lessons? What are the lessons we've learned or maybe haven't learned over 30 years?
Well, I suppose really the last 2 years has brought out so much change that it has dwarfed nearly the previous 28 years. And I saw in a report done by Sherry Fitzgerald earlier this week, it says the residential property report published by Sherry Fitzgerald backs up the theory with research that finds that the demand for housing in rural counties increased in the first quarter of this year by double digits, while supply has. Now, I think, the national planning framework, which decides what happens in planning throughout the country, and it's especially important now because all counties have to have their planning or their future planning plan decided by, I think it's January of next year. Now, they're guided by the National Planning Framework legislation. And I'd say the lessons we've learned over the last 2 years should demand that be changed, because they have kind of, in their plans, have not provided for rural housing the same as it needs to be. A lot of us things changed during the pandemic. A lot of us had different ideas, different thoughts, different ways of life, work-life balance changed. Some people got consumed by the pandemic. But one of the big things is people working from home realised what they were missing in not living in areas where they could have better local environment, better community spirit, and that has to be provided for. And as I say, I live in a rural area. The community spirit is fantastic, whether it's through GEA, local clubs, or whatever. And that has to be provided for. People don't want to live in bigger cities anymore. If they can commute to once or twice a week, because things are never going to be the same again. I was talking to someone who worked in one of the big Facebooks or Google, I'm not quite sure which, yesterday. And he said he went back to the office for the first time in 3 months on last Friday. And he said it was eerie. There were so few people in there. So there's going to be lots of big buildings left in Dublin, unoccupied. And I think, as I say, people like him is working from home, and he's working internationally from home. And he's finding it quite good. He says, I'll go back once a week or once a month or whatever is needed. But that's it.
Seamus beside you there might pick up on that very point. I mean, in 31 years, is that the biggest change that we've seen in the last 2 years, or are there other challenges really that you've seen over that 31-year period?
I think, as Pat says, that is, in the last 2 years, we are seeing massive change. But we were kind of preaching this. I remember we were at this conference down in Charleville and Cork, where we launched the programme for broadband. And we were denounced by economists and all sorts of peoples because we proposed that the only way to solve broadband was to bring it to every single house and building in the country. And that was seen as massively costly. And Kieran, and you were in the media, you would have covered some of this. Even to this day, the broadband program, which is slower than it should be, is under shocking opposition from, let's call it, the money people, the economists. It's far too expensive. It's far too this and it's far too the other. And I've always said, if the electricity program, the rural electrification, was debated in the same way, we would still be under the tilly lamps and the small lights. In other words, that's the kind of thinking. And sometimes, we now know electricity works. We need it. We also know broadband. So I think the underlying challenges were coming along, but the last 2 years, I think, sharpened it up.
Thank you very much. Just before I go to the floor, I'm going to the floor very shortly. Anybody else in the panel want to comment on anything else that kind of said in his opening contribution? Because he had a long speak there. If there's anything else jumped out of it, go ahead, Jim.
I think he did a brilliant job. I think I'd like to see him on the national playing.
You got a new job,
because he's common sense, and that's what's missing in lots of things.
But he said also that, we've been playing up this rural thing as Ireland's dead for too long as well. He said it was always this way.
Look at Ireland is no longer dead, or Ireland is no longer dead. It's as simple as that. Yeah. If I were getting into a business tomorrow morning, I'd seriously consider farming, because that's where the future is going to be. Mark my words, there's going to be a scarcity of food before the end of this year. The prices are going to go through the roof, and that's the business to be in.
Get the land. Go and get the land. Okay, let's hear from the floor. Get an opportunity, if we can, to pick up a couple of your questions. You've had to listen now for at least an hour, so this is your chance. So if you can identify yourself, your name and your organisation, and just one question, and we get around. I'll try and take 4 or 5, and then go back to the panel. Okay? First beginner. I have to write these down.
John Murphy, small dairy farmer. My farm is in the Bright Project, and I work for Farmers Safety. I would just like to thank Conor Scahan. The second and third slides that he showed about the changing opinions that are coming into the countryside. I lived in Essex 20 years ago, and I saw those exact dynamics breaking out. People coming into the countryside who have very strong opinions about how farming should be, and I commend Mayor Murray Lavery on getting the message of farming out to the large population in this countryside who don't understand farming anymore. I think it's fantastic. But my question for the group is, do you think that Irish agriculture is doing enough to get our message out there? And there's an awful lot of children in this country who see farming from the roadside and don't actually ever get onto a farm and see how farming is done. And do you feel that we're losing, or are we winning the PR battle?
For careers, basically.
No, not necessarily just.
Do you mean?
Careers.
Yeah, how do you mean?
For
careers, but policy-wise.
Policy.
General opinion.
Okay, thank you. Next one. Anybody else? We'll try and take 4, and we'll come back to the panel.
Tom Lavin, living in Sligo, very involved in the GEA and other things like that, in a very rural, isolated area. Numbers on the local clubs are diminishing or reducing, and it's hard to get a senior team of a panel of 20. Now, I think Pat hit the nail on the head when he talked about rural planning for housing in rural areas. And there's one shortcoming of the future of rural development in Ireland. It doesn't mention once-off housing in rural areas. And I raised that with an official from the department, and he said no, so that it doesn't. I think that's something, and I like Mr. Sheath's report, that he can work on our behalf.
Very good, thank you. 2 more. We'll take another lady at the back. Gentleman at the back of that side as well will take the floor.
It's just to follow up on what that man said there and Maria.
Just go identify yourself, just start, please.
Maura Canning from Galway.
Thanks, Maura.
Tutor and sheep farmer, and I would have been involved in the Irish Farmers Association in the past. It's just to follow up. It's true, like what Pat was saying there, Maria, with rural Ireland and Conor as well. You know, it comes up through the ranks with the kids because, you know, there's kids that will leave the country and they have no choice maybe and come back, but we really have to keep the rural Ireland alive. And also, it's the education of the kids into the schools as well, which is a particular thing that should be more and more on the farming side, because there is ag science in secondary schools. There is Agri-Aware do a great job, or try to do a great job, but when you ask national schools, did they open the brief that they sent in? No, they didn't. And a lot of money goes in through that system of Agri-Aware. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Agri-Aware, but they educate kids on CAP and farm safety and the likes of what Irish Rural Link want to do here with farmers for safety as well. And I don't want to go on, but I'm just saying...
Not enough is being done, basically.
The education is to highlight it more, because when you take, for instance, I'll give you one example. We had hens at home, and needless to say, the fox came and took them all.
So did we, by the way. I remember it well. The trauma of my mother. I'm going.
This is only a couple of years ago.
Of course, again.
He came and took them the one night, but that's not the story. The story is we had a bunch of kids in that came to buy Hurleys. That's probably 5-6 years ago. And when the hens were running around the yard, they wanted to eat eggs at home, but they actually didn't know what hens were. From school that was in Galway. And that just sent it home to me, even though I think if your child comes into my farm, or your child comes into my farm, that we automatically, if they know where milk comes from, they know where eggs come from. They don't. And I think that's where we need to get that for rural Ireland to stay alive.
Thank you very much.
The speakers.
Brilliant. Fourth one and last one on this side. There's up there, isn't it? Hopefully we get some nice response from the panel. We'll get back to you again, hopefully, then. Go ahead.
Paddy.
I know this man. He told me he was here the very first day that Irish Rural Link was formed. Seamus, is that be correct? Paddy Egan.
Not popular running much saying it. Just to be very brief, he said there that Irish Rural Area was saying. I lived beside a farm, or a 400-acre holding that was divided in 1932 on 10 farmers. A new roadway put in and houses built. Today, one farmer owns 90% of that again, and he doesn't live on it. So it's back where it was. So rural Ireland, it's,
Ranches, Paddy. We're back to ranches, is it?
Yeah, it's bad. That was a divide. It was supposed to be the answer to the problem, the rural problem. 10 farmers put into a 400-acre farm divided by the land commission. Today, one farmer owns 90%.
Fair point. Thank you very much. Fair point. Let's go back to the panel. Thank you very much. We'll go back to you in a moment. There was a couple of planning ones out there. Maybe Conor would ask you to come in on those for starters, just to touch on it. There's nothing about once-off houses, is there? Is that gone? Is it?
Well, is this on? In terms of the farming one, they're making real progress going into the future for rural Ireland. Is going to also involve.
Speaking to us, or speaking to yourself?
Yes. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. We'll be able to try and accommodate. No, there was a hearing at a problem earlier on, so I'll try and accommodate you in a moment.
Here.
Okay. We'll Conor.
I'll just stand
here, Conor. Just to the main stage.
Sure.
Cheers. Thanks.
Okay.
I'll take that. Okay. Go ahead.
If we're going to talk about the future for rural Ireland, there are a bunch of very hard conversations we have to have with ourselves and with the agricultural community. And they include, and Mairead would know this, how extraordinarily badly Ireland's agricultural productivity is in sectors like beef. We've got to face up to that. We've got to have bigger units with higher levels of productivity. We've got to have innovation. And we've got to accept the fact that the rural community has got to be open to itself being challenged, and that agriculture is not a sacred cow who cannot be asked to undertake the same risks and the same innovation as every other part of society does as well. That's a hard question, hard conversation we have to have with ourselves. RTE, for their foolishness, gave me a rostrum on the Late Show one night, and four other people, including the TD Morris, were unable to give a single solitary answer to counter that point I'm trying to put across. There are big challenges there, and they're not easy ones.
Thank you very much. We're going to go back to you on the couple of farmer ones that go there. You have a mic. Just bring it up as close as you can.
Gentlemen, hear me.
Can you hear the ladies?
Yeah, you can. Grand. Just in terms of our farming communities doing enough to PR and sell their story, well, they're doing a damn sight better than they were 20 years ago. 20 years ago, the only publicity we saw about Irish farming was a cow going up into a trailer struggling with BSE. And when AgriAware was established, they did a survey of MRBI of 1,000 people, and at that stage, 80% of people thought farmers were dirty. They didn't take care of their animals. They were bad for the economy. They were bad for the environment. The figures were absolutely frightening in terms of the attitude of consumers to the farming community around them. And I'm firmly of the view that if you don't have a benign attitude or a benign reaction from the people you serve, from the people you sell your food to, then you're going to live in a very malign environment when it comes to government and government policy. Within 5 years of getting into schools and talking to kids and setting up what is farming, because you think, I come from Shanagoldin, I'm down there 35 years now, but in our two twins class in primary school, we were part-time farmers and one other boy was a part-time farmer family. 7 years later, when I was the youngest fella, it was the very same figures. So most of the kids had never been on a farm in their lives, they didn't know anything about it. Now AgriAware has done an absolutely fine job there and continues to do it, and it's under the surface. And 10 years, well no actually it was 5 years after that initial survey, when the same question was asked again of 1,000 people, the answers were totally inverted.
80% approval rating for the way farmers looked after the environment. They looked after their animals. And that approval rating has maintained. And incredibly, through the Celtic Tiger, the rating of agriculture as being important to the Irish economy stayed really high, in the high 70s. So that is one way that they keep track of it. I think in other ways, in terms of change that's happened, Austin Finn, the Land Mobility Service, many of you won't have heard about it. But one of the big things of the decline in farming in rural Ireland is people not being matched up. Somebody who's farming and wants to farm more part-time, wants to retire into the background, but doesn't want to sell their land, doesn't want to have no more involvement. And Austin Finn there, on a pilot project that's only going a couple of years now, has matched up over 520 families and, you know, matching people together. So he's at least hit over 1,000 people, and 47,000 acres of land has gone into different kinds of farming. Not different kinds of farming, but different ways of farming. Okay. So there is an awful lot happening on the ground. When I moved to Shanagoldin 35 years ago next month, Sean Lavery, my husband, is here with me, I had a little white Fiesta car. And it was my pride and joy. I bought it out of my own money, paid for it, all the rest of it. And I put it into the local garage for a service as Mairead Woollahan, because that was my licence and I owned the car. And I thought it might be awkward otherwise. So I put the car in for a service. I got the bill back in an envelope, Mrs. Sean Lavery. Mrs. Sean Lavery. I'm still young enough.
I hope he paid for it.
He hadn't anything to do with it. He paid for the service stuff. But I'm young enough still, or old enough. I'm old enough to remember the local papers where the women were down, and you know, there was a woman at a dress dance or a dinner dance or something, and the names were all underneath the photograph, and it would be Mrs. Sean Lavery, Mrs. Mike O'Flynn, Mrs. Dan Prendergast. It wouldn't have been the woman's own name. Yeah, no doubt. And that change has started to happen. And agriculture in so many aspects of the sector have driven that change. Women are now involved in everything, and are figureheads in so many, but more than figureheads, they're models of how to do the work and how to do the job in so many areas.
And as proven as in our Snoop Draw, for starters.
Where they're doing fantastically well is on Instagram and TikTok and places like a lot of you have never been on before, where they have hundreds of thousands of people watching, putting on a set of cups on a cow to be milked, saying exactly what's happening in the milking parlour and going on. And we don't necessarily see that, but it's hugely significant. And young women in farming are doing it all over the country. And they are making, they're making agriculture, I won't say sexy, but it's explaining it at really ground level.
Good.
So just because you don't see it doesn't mean it isn't there.
More, do you want to come in I'll do this one. This thing is better, I think. Yeah, I think you're very close. Just one thing about the school. I don't know enough from schools.
A point I was going to pick up on was more, I think, was that made the point, and picking up a little bit on Tom's point as well about the one-off housing. And when we're talking about services, and one of the things, obviously, that we are very strongly advocating for is the provision of proper early years, fit-for-purpose early years childcare systems. Because if you are setting up a business, if you are working in rural Ireland, if you're thinking of relocating, you need to have a proper childcare system in order for us to have a functioning economy. Yeah. But one of the things within our creche is we bring in the pet farm. We go out and visit the pet farms, but we bring in the pet farms. We bring in the animals into the creche. We have a creche garden. We have a polytunnel where we grow a lot of fruit and veg for the creche kitchen, so that the children can see this is where...
And this is not just at Christmas, this happens all the time.
This happens all the time. So children can see exactly where the food is coming from. And it might sound like a very small thing, but I think exactly to your point, Maura, this is how we start to foster that understanding and that love of the land, if you like, from a very, very early age. Because a lot of the children, we have a very multicultural service, think that food comes out of a packet, or that mommy opens the freezer, daddy opens the fridge, and it comes out of there. They don't make the connection. So I think that kind of education is really important.
Thank you, Tara. Seamus, we're going to have ranches. Paddy thinks we're going back to where we were with the big farmers running the country.
I remember I wrote back in the 80s when I was farming about ranches, and I said we would return eventually to ranches because of the way we were going. And Joe Ray come at me and attacked me left, right and centre that I was talking absolute nonsense. But there is a case, there is a reality here, especially as Conor Skehan has said, in the beef farming reality. Now, as a young farmer, very quickly, I had a small piggery. I went up to 25, 30 sows and was doing okay until the oil crisis in 1980, I think it was, thereabouts. Overnight, within 2 months, every single one of them had to go because I just wasn't big enough and I couldn't cope with what was 100% increase in feed. And there is a real challenge in the beef situation, and I think Conor Skehan is asking a very fundamental question. The policymakers are going to have to look at how we manage beef, or else we will be in real trouble.
You can hand it on to Pat McDonough. I'll ask you one question, Pat. Certain things have happened this year to try and make people grow more cereal, and initiatives are on the way, but you're still predicting hunger and food shortage at the end of the year, are you?
Well, first of all, just let me say that whatever... Hold on, now will we see if the job is on at all.
It is, yeah.
Can you hear me?
Up to your mouth, yeah.
No. Hold on a second. I thought Maureen wasn't being heard.
No, use that one.
Can you hear me now?
No, use that one. Just keep it very close to you. Good stuff.
All right, now, am I better?
Yeah.
Someone turned up the volume, thanks. First of all, let me say that whatever the Irish farming community are doing in relation to the quality of the food they produce, it's well established that it's the best food in the world. And that's why you have the British, you have the Germans, you have the French even now, looking to import Irish beef. Now, I don't know what the reason for it is, but that's what's happening in reality. And so, therefore, the cost of beef is going through the roof. Likewise, there was a milk farmer down there, and I'm sure he's very happy with his 50 cents a litre for milk. And, that's just what's happening. And that's going to continue to happen, and it's going to increase. Why I say, Kieran, that there is going to be, obviously, the Ukrainian war is going to have a big effect on it, because that's where all the corn comes from for feeding cattle and feeding chickens, etc. So if there's a scarcity, that automatically puts up the price. But I forget what was the other question you asked me.
You covered it and covered it adequately.
Okay.
We've only about 10 minutes left, so I promised the floor we'd go back and we're going to hear 4 more questions on the floor because there's lots of hands up. And we'll get 4 short questions and 4 short answers before we finish up and get some more views. Thank you very much for your contributions, by the way. It's nice to have an active panel. I've often stood on the stage and looked around and nobody put up their hand. Made my job easier today. And thank you to the panel for their flexibility. Go ahead.
My name is John Moore. I'm work for a company called Mayo Plus. And I'm extremely impressed with the level of discussion here today. But I think one of the things that's overlooked is where our policy is dominated by regional, models. And I think we have strength at a local level, at a county level, and that can be much more effective. And as proven, we have at a local level. So I'm just wondering what the response of the panel would be to adopt a local county-based development model rather than a regional development model.
Thank you. Next one. Gentleman on the front. Thank you.
I just want to say that the one thing we're looking here with everything that's going on in rural Ireland is we have an industry within rural Ireland, within agriculture that's in crisis, and that's the forestry sector, the private forestry sector, the timber. Now, I'm pushing this since the year 1998 that the agriculture forestry owner, the private sector, needs to be able to trade his own carbon. Now, absolutely, everywhere he goes, I'm told by Thomas and everyone else, oh no, we can't, there's no mechanism there to do it. I have several industries that would want to buy, no, I'm not interested in greenwashing. This has to be valuable for the farmer, valuable for the private grower as well within Ireland. This is $1 trillion worth of business that we could keep in this country, and we could grow ourselves sustainably. And it is so important for carbon sequestration, storage and mitigation of these greenhouse gases. It is very hard even to persuade farmers to value their own tree. They'll tell me the actual, what they get per kilo, what they get per litre of milk. If you say to them, what do you get for soda? What's soda?
Yeah.
Your trees grow.
Yeah, thank you.
They are an industry within itself, within agriculture, but yet we have a poor relation to agriculture.
Thank you very much. Next.
Hi, my name is Mary McKenna and I work in rural transport, and I suppose I was really pleased to see that rural transport came up on the slides today. People forget that with the loss of services that we see in rural Ireland, rural transport is the only way people can get to work, get to socialise, get to do the things that they want to do. The investment in rural transport must continue, and it must continue not just from a top-down way, but also from a bottom-up way, because if we don't talk to the people and find out what they want, then you don't respond to them. Thank you very much.
Miriam, thanks very much.
Yeah.
And do you think it's bad for you with your family in the area? Imagine living in Dunamon Castle with 52 people from Ukraine, but nobody has a car at all. Next one. There's one more, sir.
About the danger in agriculture. Some places farms are as primitive today as they were when their Lord was there. And all the money is going into towns to build up the milking. You go through the country now and there's acres and acres of sheds. There's been sheds knocked and rebuilt, modernised, knocked and rebuilt and modernised, and what you can, and some money has went, not a penny has went to certain areas. There's people in the country that never got any grant of any sort, of any kind, and all the money has been spilled out. Now, where in the name of God is rural Ireland if you don't bring them on? I do the Lloyd again. That's as primitive and as ancient as the Lord was here.
Thank you.
The Lloyd again, right? Just a second. Now, if, for instance, a fella can come in there and he can plough 200 acres in a couple of hours, and it'd take me 14 days to do that, 1 acre. Like, we have to realise that there's something happening. They're human beings. They've been left behind because there was no grants, everything committed to them. It was either age, it was this, that and the other. They weren't up to standard, they hadn't money, they hadn't this, that and the other. The other boys hadn't anything either. But they got everything. Now, until we bring on the ones that's low down, we're going nowhere. It's not top down, it's bottom up.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to break my own rule here. Maybe we do 2 more and then we back the panel. And the lady over this side as well, if we could get her, please. Go ahead, Jazz, back, yeah.
Sean Finance here, I'm former market firm president and CEO of the Irish Bioenergy Association. I'd like to acknowledge IRL and the work that James is doing. I think it's very valuable from a rural Ireland perspective. My point, the farmers of the past and rural Ireland of the past was the producer of food, fuel and fibre. The policy landscape has brought us to a food-producing nation to the detriment of the fuel and fibre elements, which certainly provide many opportunities and will provide opportunities in the future. However, political ideology is trumping pragmatism at the moment in terms of a lot of the European strategies in the Irish documents which are there, in that there's a lot of new industries that could be established but aren't being established because policies aren't being put in place and the political environment isn't supportive. So my question to the panel is, how can we change that? And by new industries, I'm referring to anaerobic digestion, kin, maybe more biomass crops, wide variety of different types of industries which would help us in terms of decarbonisation, reduce our emissions, provide alternative jobs, alternative income streams, and reduce our dependence on fossil fuels. So I'd just like to get a panel view of how do we work to ensure that our political ideologies don't trump the pragmatism of getting new industries set up.
Thank you very much. Maria, do you want to come over here and tell us the response to that?
Got a mic there.
I'll give you the best man in the house.
I don't know about that now.
Yeah, I'll get you. Get a mic. It's coming back to you there now. Thank you. Sorry about the radio mics. This is the problem when you go around there.
Well, I'm not going to be able to answer all of that. But I just, the one thing on the ranchers taking over, you know, that 400 acres of land that was initially given out by the Land Commission, I often stand and say to myself, how on earth has the economic system that we have allowed farmers to continue own land? They're making no more of it. It's one of the scarcest resources ever on the planet now, between, you know, water and you know, good land where you can farm. And I'd be far more worried about ex-Russian oligarchs coming in and buying the land of Ireland than Irish farmers doing it. We are very lucky that we still have our hands on it, and that it is, on the whole, owned by 150,000 people in all sorts of scales right across the country. So, just in terms of the carbon, now which question now was it? I'm getting myself mixed up. The last question.
The very last one was bioenergy. We was coming from, but it was really one, I suppose, that political ideology is not allowing the progress of other.
Well, I can't understand why that is.
I thought we were going green.
I went on a trip once with ICMSA and up to Sweden and Denmark. And every village that we went to had their own digester, where all the waste from the village or the small town and the farms was used to create energy for the community. And it was free energy, or cost very little. And I couldn't figure out, why don't we do that here? What's the problem with that? I mean, and I don't know whether it would have to go through miles and miles of planning, but it seems to me to make absolute sense that the waste of an area is digested in the area and used to provide electricity for the area.
Thank you very much. John Moore wanted to know, Conor, why we can't go on a county model instead of a regional model. I think we have county development plans, in fairness.
We do. The trick, at the risk of overusing that word, is to give the right power to the right level. We are burdened in Ireland by the fact that we are the most centralised bureaucracy in all of Europe. Ireland remains more centralised than Poland and Hungary and former communist countries, and it's the thing that we never talk about. So the gentleman is absolutely correct. The healthiest countries are the ones that devolve as much appropriate power to the most appropriate level. I was a member and I set up the Devolution Commission way back in the day to try and transfer that power. Every single senior civil servant did everything they could to stop it, and it was killed in its tracks.
Tara, there was a question about rural transport. We haven't got enough of it. We need to get more of it, obviously.
Absolutely agree with Mary McKenna. I think it's, you know, from our perspective as a women's organisation, and even trying to access services around the town and the county of Longford, and it's the same for other rural counties. If you cannot access the services, you're immediately at a disadvantage. And that's whether you're accessing, whether it's education, training, childcare, domestic violence, whatever it is. If we don't have a fit for purpose rural transport system, we're on hiding to nothing, and we're already then looking at, exactly as Conor was saying about the different rurals. And there are very different rural communities for women and children and families in Ireland, depending on the level of access they have to services. So we have to look at whether we're rural proofing is one issue. And one other final point, we're just talking about the theme of today and going back to 1991. The Commission for the Status of Women in 1991 made a recommendation that all memorandums for government, as they call them, should be assessed for the probable impact on women of any change in policy. Now that's 30 years ago. I don't really see that happening. Maybe it's something that the second panel might look at for the future, but I think the same attitude for rural proofing and for transport as well.
Can I just come in there on the local link as well?
If it'll work, it will, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, local link. Look out for local link all over rural Ireland. I spent a week on the buses. What it's doing in terms of, you think of your local bus and it's driving you into the local town. But what local link is doing is so much more important. I travelled on a bus where there was a lot of men on it, men in their 60s and 70s. They had no cert. They couldn't drive for health reasons anymore. The little village they were living in, the butcher shop was closed and so was the groceries. It was going to cost them most of their pension to get in and out of the local town. The number of kids who now, if you were living in West Kildare or North Offaly, you would have to stay in digs in Maynooth if you're going to college there. The local link bus is bringing them to college and home, and the numbers going to third level in that catchment area has increased dramatically. Fight for local link. It really is an excellent service, and what it absolutely needs is multi-annual planning or funding. They can't plan ahead. They can't work, with just annual funding, not knowing if it's going to be there next year.
Thank you.
So those involved in the rural groups, get behind local link.
Thank you, Brad. Two questions answered. Two questions not answered. And my job is to try and make sure everybody's question is answered. So I'm going to leave it to the two guys here on the end to pick one. Forestry, or the small man is left out. That's the summary. You get the choice, Seamus. Forestry should be doing more, Pat. That's the other one.
Yeah, I mean, going back to the bottom up, Irish Rural Link has always been bottom up. And I mean, one of the things we did, and I have to say this is what we do best. We advocate. We mightn't always get it right, but we advocate. And Miriam is looking at me, and Mr. Skibbons and a few others who were in the transport. If you remember, folks, when we sort of crowded Leinster House around they were thinking of stopping the local link, as Mairead said, because it was still a pilot project after nearly 10 years, or something like that. And we sort of turned up with, we organised the turn up. Ian Russell, I don't know if you're here, but you caused all of this. There he is. And then he told me the day beforehand, and I didn't know what to do. But anyway, Miriam McKenna was on it and all the other transport. We filled Leinster House area with buses. And the ordinary women and men on those buses filled the RTE programmes that day. And 2 days later, they were announcing the mainstreaming of then the rural transport programme. So going back to the question of on the ground, we have to look after, like the small holder has a better chance of honouring the commitments to climate change than anyone else I can think of. But he and she needs the chance.
Last word to Pat. Forestry, be on, Pat.
I'm not really qualified, I suppose, to speak about forestry, but I think to invest in forestry, you have to have returns don't come for, maybe corrected this, for the first 15 years until there's a thinning or whatever process, and then you really get the money after about 30 years, the return on it. Not very many people can afford to do that. So that's only looking at it from an outside point of view of business. Anyway, I'm not very well up on it, so I'm not going to say very much more. But just to go back to another question, like the reason that I suppose farms are getting bigger is that younger people may not be interested in doing what their parents did. And when they look at their parents working 7 days a week, whether it's milking cows or fathering or whatever, and have no time off, that's not what young people want for the future. They want regular hours, regular pay, know where they are. And this is one of the changes that pandemic has brought. We would find it across the country, and all businesses are stuck for staff at the minute. Everything, especially the hospitality business. But there has been a change in the mindset. As I say, the work-life balance has very much come into play. People are now more anxious to have quality time with their families and work regular hours, preferably, as say, Monday to Friday, 9 to 5. That's going to bring a massive change to this country in the next few years. But as I say, going back to the farming side of it, I would not like to see factory farms taking over this country, because our grass-fed animals are better than anything else.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, on your behalf, I'd like you to put your hands together for our panel this morning. Pat McDonough, Tara Farrell, Seamus Boland and Ray Lavery. I hope you enjoyed it. I know it got you going. That was an important part of it. I hope it keeps you going, because when we come back after the break, we're going to talk about the new Ireland. We have a new panel, and we're going to talk about some other things that have happened and are changing as we go along. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Same rules apply for the second half. The only potential singer I had with a mobile phone was on the PA system, so I couldn't plug him out. I had to let him away with it, but if your phone does go off, we'll ask you to sing, I know that. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to move to part two. So you had a very thought-provoking section one there, very thought-provoking, some fantastic statistics Conor brought forward to us. But what about the future? What about the new Ireland, the Ireland of 2022? Life after the pandemic, life after COVID, life as we go forward. We have a superb panel to speak to you this afternoon. I'll start beside me for starters. Here, Dr. Maura Farrell is with just to my left, to your right. She's a senior lecturer in the School of Geography, Archaeology and Irish Studies. Maura's teaching reflects her research specialism, which revolves around rural and agricultural geography, where published and presented research work extensively on the national and international scene. We're going to hear from her in some depth in a few moments. Dr. Larry O'Connell is here, from the Director of the National Economic and Social Council, Chief Officer of the National Economic Social Development Office. Started as a senior economist with NESC since 2007. He worked in a range of policy areas, including Ireland's transition to low carbon and digital future. We heard a bit about that this morning, didn't we? Down at the very far end, I think it's Alan, just coming into my view. Alan is going to speak to us today with regard to his particular area of expertise, which is, looking at his notes again. Transfer rural link, I know that, but I have just managed to use my introducer. So Alan, you introduce yourself very shortly. I do apologise. I had all your academic achievements, Alan, and your career in front of me. I'll find it again in a moment. Fintan O'Brien is there beside Alan. Fintan is the Assistant Secretary General with responsibility for rural development. You will, I can do. Will Faulkner of Radio 3 wants to take over as MC, so I'm going to give him the job very shortly. Thanks, Will. Fintan O'Brien is the Assistant Secretary of the Department of Rural and Community Development, with responsibility for this key area, Rural Development and Regional Affairs Division. His area of responsibility also includes overseeing the implementation of Ireland's Rural Development Policy, Our Rural Future. You heard it this morning. Yuramo Adegini is the first African-Irish woman to be elected as the Mayor in Ireland. She migrated from Nigeria to Longford in 2003 and identifies as Irish and African. Joined Fianna Fáil in 2016. She became a councillor in 2020. We met once before, she just reminded me, at the general election count. Kate Flood is here. Kate is a PhD candidate based in the School of Geography, Archaeology and Irish Studies, National University of Galway. Mark Foley is here with us today. Mark is the Airbridge Chief Executive. Mark joined the company as Chief Executive in June 2018, having held the role of Managing Director of Land Solutions in Quilcha since January 2016. Previously, Mark was involved as Managing Director of Quilcha Enterprise. So I've got everybody except Alan. He's going to have to give us a full rundown of his CV when he gets a chance in a moment. You know, his organisation was mentioned so many times at the beginning today. I think you know the value of Rural Link and the first contribution. I'm sure we're going to hear more. Ladies and gentlemen, a bit like the first section, we're going to, I suppose, whet your appetite for what could be ahead of us. What are the future concepts that we are going to have to live within our life? How will rural Ireland, or indeed urban Ireland for that matter, develop? It's a great honour for me to introduce our first speaker. Please welcome Dr. Maura Farrell.
Thanks, Kieran, and thanks to everybody, and thanks to Rural Link, and congratulations on their 30th anniversary. It's great to be here. Before I left Galway this morning, I was talking to my mother on the phone, and I told her that I was presenting at this conference, and she said, whatever you do, don't mention turf or there'll be a row. So I won't be mentioning turf, okay? That was my only piece of advice leaving this morning. But my presentation title is Looking at Rural Ireland, Our Long-Term Vision. And I suppose, looking over the next 30 years, I found this quotation that I always like, and it says, "The present is determined by our past actions and the future by our present." And I think that's what I'm going to think about, that's what I'm going to talk about. I've maybe hit in on some specific kind of areas, and I've kept others quite general, because in all fairness, there's so much that we could talk about over the next 30 years. Please God, we'll all be here, which is the main thing. I'm going to start, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about setting up a context for our future. And as, I suppose, a rural academic, we talk a lot about this idea of rural restructuring. And we talk about Ireland as it is now has become a restructured rural. And what do we mean by that? All we mean really is that we've seen fundamental changes in rural areas over the last 30 years. And those fundamental changes are very different than we've seen right across our history. And they're different because of the pace. They're different because of the persistence and the totality of that change. And that change, in many respects, it's driven. And it's driven by three things. It's driven by technological innovations, the innovations that we've seen over the last number of years. The fact that now, I suppose somebody is on Twitter tweeting and somebody all over the world can pick that up. Social modernization, this idea that we have a changed society, this idea that we have mass education, this idea that we really, I suppose, are no longer governed by religion, or this idea also of globalization, this idea of connectivity that Conor mentioned earlier on this morning as well. And I suppose when we talk about this connectivity has allowed this fundamental change to happen in rural areas. And when we talk about this fundamental change or this rural restructuring, what we see is a new picture. We see a new picture of rural Ireland. And this new picture brings us and shows us that we have many issues that we need to consider, but we also have many positives. And I suppose the first issue that we're always thinking about at the moment, because it's foremost in our mind, is this idea of post-COVID. Where are we economically? Where are we with isolation? Where are we with healthcare? Where's the uncertainty in and around COVID still? Demographic change is something that's also there. And I'm going to talk specifically about demographic change, and particularly two areas of demographic change, the older and the younger people in rural areas. Climate concerns and climate action is something that we're all thinking about now and we're all concerned about. Agricultural decline was mentioned extensively this morning. But agricultural change, maybe we should start thinking about change as much as we're thinking about decline. Economic inequality. We have rural areas, in peripheral rural areas, that are, without a doubt, we have to question if they're in decline or not. But we also have areas on the cusp of urban centres that are very much thriving. We have questions around services, we have questions around facilities and amenities. Broadband and transport were mentioned this morning. We have employment opportunities now that we may never have had before in rural areas, but we have quality jobs that we need within rural areas. What about all of these positive things we have within rural at the moment? We have an environmental landscape that we really should be proud of. We have a quality of life that came to the fore, I suppose, definitely within our COVID period. Remote working has become more of an opportunity now than it ever was before. Any of the rural development people within, I suppose, this room will talk about this idea of endogenous development. This idea of rural development from the bottom up, from within the community. And the LEADER programme over the last 30 years has led that endogenous rural development. Community integration, this idea that we can have communities in rural Ireland that we are proud of. I suppose the positivity around this thinking of smart villages now and into the future is something that I'm going to allude to as well. When we talk about the future of rural areas, we have to, suppose, think about what we have now, and we talk a lot about sustainability. And into the future in 30 years' time, if we have a sustainable rural Ireland, that's exactly what we want. But sustainability is built on society, the environment, and economics. And that's what I'm going to kind of look at this future. Looking at society, again, of course, there's huge changes within society, as Conor mentioned earlier on this morning. Demographic trends. We do actually have more people living in rural Ireland than across any other country in Europe. We've over 31% of Irish people are living in rural Ireland today. And I suppose when you talk about rural areas not being homogenous, again, as Conor said this morning, no rural area is the same, and you just need to talk to people about the GA. My God, they'll tell you that they're not the same. You have this decline in population in some areas, but you have some areas that are thriving and that are overpopulated in some respects. Let's look at two things into the future that we have to give serious consideration to, and that is our elderly in rural areas and our youth. We have the highest population of elderly people currently living in rural areas, and this is going to continue into the future. So into the future, how do we manage this? Where are the trends that we need to consider around our elderly in rural areas? And I suppose we really have to look at the increased need for services and facilities for older people, the care industry, the supportive housing and independent living industry. What about older farmers? Shane Conway is here with me today from Inuit Galway, has done extensive work on older farmers in rural areas. Older farmers that are maybe looking to retire, not wanting to retire. What do we do? Where is this question in and around older farmers? We had a talk last week from a group in UCC on our Rural Voices series in Inuit Galway, and they talked about the silver economy. So when you talk about older people in rural areas, you can also see the economic value of older people in rural areas. And that's something into the future that we should consider as well. On the other flip side, I suppose, of older people in rural areas, you have youth and young people. And at the moment, we're involved in a Horizon 2020 ruralisation project that has 18 countries working across Europe in relation to this idea of ruralisation. And one of the work packages that we were working on was in relation to youth. And we did a study in relation to the dream futures. What are the dream futures of our young people living in rural areas? And we carried out 2,000 surveys in 10 different EU countries right across Europe, including here in Ireland. And we looked to about 20, 35, 18 and 35-year-olds, and we asked them questions in and around their livelihood recipes. We asked them about their accommodation. We asked them about their lifestyle. How do they intend to live? Where do they intend to live? And how do they intend to earn a living into the future? And I suppose some of the results that we came up with were quite interesting in the sense that quite a lot of these young people wanted to stay in rural areas, but they also wanted to stay within a capacity or within a proximity to, I suppose, an urban centre. We also looked again at the accommodation, and this is quite interesting. The people who spoke this morning about one-off housing, and please don't shoot the messenger, I didn't come up with the results here, but the majority of young people did suggest that they wanted to live in detached houses, again within a rural setting. Again, their lifestyle dreams are very much rural orientated. You're looking at sport, exercise, enjoying outdoors. You're looking at community activities and volunteerism. You're looking at creative hobbies and visualization. You're looking at a lot of ideas into the future that can be accommodated by rural living. We also looked at the behaviour tendencies of these young people into the future. And again, we started to see that they were really into this idea of quality of life. They're much more interested in having a good quality of life and having, I suppose, behaviours of work that really can accommodate that kind of quality of life. The key messages we were getting out of this Futures Dream research that we did was that young people want to either remain or return to rural Ireland. They want to live in a rural setting, but they also want to live near urban centres, or they want to have the facilities of urban centres. So the question remains, do we start to provide those kind of facilities and services to keep young people in rural areas? They want to live in detached houses. They want to engage in community and voluntary activities. They want a work-life balance, which is hugely important. They want quality jobs in a rural area. They want jobs that are equated to their qualifications. Another area in relation to society that I want you to think about, I suppose, into the future, and something that we all have to think about, and this is inclusion and diversity. We are living in an Ireland, in a rural Ireland, that really has migration at the forefront at this very, very particular time. We have return migrants, we have EU migrants, refugees, we have forced migrants, and foremost in our minds at the moment are Ukraine migrants. In 2016, the CSO results, which hopefully we'll have new ones very soon, showed us that we had 200 different nationalities living in this country. 200 people from different countries are living in this country. And into the future, we've got to think about that. We've got to think about the identity of those people. These people, now we're looking at this and this idea of the new Irish, this idea of the identity and the belonging, this idea of the acceptance and the inclusion of people. And it's very poignant, I suppose, that we consider those issues and we don't go down the route of some other European countries. We don't, we're very careful of this idea of the rise of this very right-wing populist kind of thinking that considers migrants as these dangerous others. And we have to really be careful about that kind of thinking. We talked about, I suppose, this morning, Conor talked about looking backwards, and all of us have a historical patriotism. We are very patriotic to this country that we love and that we live in, but we also must accept that civic and cultural patriotism is a part of the new Irish that are living here. These people can come here and they can love this country just as much as we can. So I suppose we need to build rural areas that can benefit from new populations, benefit from migrants, benefit from their diversity, and from them also as potential employees and workers in rural areas. Another area of sustainability into the future is the environment. And I suppose this is an area that there's so many trends there. We have everything, again, from climate action, biodiversity, land use. Mairead Lavery mentioned land use this morning. And our access to land is absolutely so important. Sustainable energy, water protection, agriculture as we see it now and as we can see it into the future. Community engagement is also hugely important. Where are the opportunities into the future when we consider the environment? We have to think about new systems of agriculture. We have to think about new diversifications of agriculture. We have to think about new entrants into farming. What about the young people coming into farming? What about people who have never been involved in farming and want to engage in the agriculture industry? Biodiversity we have to think about. Our green credentials. I suppose wetlands and peatlands. Kate is here with us as well today and who can talk much more freely about this issue. Locally led water schemes. Are these the way into the future in relation to water protection? So our environment is definitely something into the future that we will have to give huge considerations to. Our policy agenda at the moment, and again Conor mentioned this earlier on this morning, the policy directives that we have include everything that we need. We just must make sure that they're followed through. We must make sure that everything that's in there, we look to have completed. We look to drive forward. So really, the policies that we have across Europe and that we have here in Ireland, they tackle all of these issues. We just must make sure that they're followed through. I'm going to look at a trend in relation to the environment. And again, it was great to hear somebody here today from the Bride Project. And this trend that I'm going to look at is this idea of the European Innovation Partnerships for Agriculture. And you might know them at the moment as EIP Agri. This trend, I suppose, again, Fenton O'Brien was one of the people who, I suppose, drove this trend right at the very beginning in the Department of Agriculture. This idea of EIP agriculture has everything from the environment to innovation to community to new technology to everything. We have an absolute host of people around the country looking at issues and problems and trying to solve them via innovation and new technology. We have new ways to deal with environmental issues. They're very innovative ways, they're innovative thinking. This idea of new technology is right at the heart of some of this idea. Communities are engaged in EIP Agri operational groups at the moment. And this multi-actor approach is something that we need as well to take to the future. This idea of stopping the silos, this idea of the farmers working with the advisors working with the researchers working with the farmers, and bringing all of this together under this idea of EIP Agri. And again, one of these, again, this Farm Health this morning, and I know Niamh, who's here with us as well, Niamh Nolan is leading the Irish Rural Link Farm Health Safety EIP Agri operational group as well at the moment. So again, huge trends here into the future in relation to how we can solve some issues in agriculture. If we're looking at economic trends, again, there are huge trends. I've mentioned endogenous development. We must have development from the bottom up. This is where we need to develop small rural communities, this idea of competitive small to medium enterprises. I suppose going back into the future, we had this idea that we needed international companies to come here. We needed international companies to come to rural areas or the area was dying. Now we need small to medium enterprises that are really developed from that rural area itself. The food industry, Pat McDonough mentioned this earlier on today, it is huge trend into the future. Tourism, environmental, educational, historical tourism, not just the ordinary, get people from Dublin down on a bus for a day. We need to kind of think outside the box when it comes to tourism. Marine and ocean economy is something as well that we really are just on the cusp of tapping into. And again, it's something into the future we need to consider. Forestry was mentioned here this morning. Again, an industry into the future that can have an economic value as well as a public good. Knowledge-based bioeconomies. And I suppose really this knowledge-based bioeconomy sector, again it was mentioned earlier on this morning, it's a huge sector into the future. The service sector at the moment is something that's keeping many small towns and villages going in rural areas. So we have to maybe look to this service sector and see what else we can put into it or pump into it. We also have to think about traditional economies in rural areas. And sometimes we kind of push the past to the past. And in a rural area that has had a traditional economy or a traditional industry, let's look at that tradition. Let's see, can we revive that tradition and revitalise that rural area because of that tradition. Internationally based companies, most definitely, there is a place in rural areas for international based companies, but alongside the small to medium enterprises that we have now. And I suppose when you look at these, when you look at how we can get to this future economic services, we have to think about investment in infrastructure, most definitely broadband, transport and housing. Remote working. Somebody said to me recently that in the last 2 years of COVID, we have jumped forward 10 years in technology. And that's exactly what we've done. To think I would sit down with an older person and say, listen, I'll Zoom you, or I'll get you on Skype, or I'll get you on whatever, would really not have even come into our psyche in only for the last 2 years. So we now can consider remote working. We can consider digital communities and digital hubs as part of a real working environment. Into the future, we have to value SMEs. We have to make sure that we see SMEs for the value that they have in maintaining and retaining work people within rural areas. Gender, and Tara mentioned gender very eloquently earlier on this morning. And really, I often do think when I come to agriculture and when I come to enterprise, that we have an untapped industry right there at our hands, and that's women. And really, all we need to do is ensure that we give them the opportunities to start up those small businesses or to become involved in agriculture, and they will take it and run. We need to value the rural, and as the Minister said this morning, we definitely need to change the rhetoric. The dying, declining Ireland does us no favours. It really doesn't. It absolutely does not. We need to think about a thriving future rural Ireland rather than this dying, declining rural. And I suppose, again, looking back at the research that we've done, we did carry out, ruralisation carried out future trends research as well. And again, we did this in 15 countries right across Europe. And funnily enough, the 3 trends that came foremost in the Irish research were, number 1, remote working, changing gender roles, and the circular economy. So those were the 3 trends that people felt over the next 30 years are going to be something that we need to consider within a rural context. Another trend that I just want to mention is this idea of smart villages. This is a kind of a concept within Europe that really has taken hold in many countries across Europe, including Ireland, over the last number of years. And it's an EU initiative really where rural communities really will enhance the towns and the villages that they live in by building on the existing strengths and the assets that they already have. They need to use innovation and they need to use technology and smart ideas to do this. And again, I see this being very much driven by the local action groups at the moment. I see Galway Rural Development having a smart village in Montbellew, my own area. And you see lots of this happening. And it really is bringing forth the community-based and driven kind of smart thinking. But it's also assisted and facilitated by policy. That's really, really important. And again, when we think about that policy, and again, Conor mentioned this morning, our rural development policy that we have at the moment, our Rural Futures, has all of this in it. We just must make sure that it's all delivered on. We must make sure that enhancing public services, revitalising towns and villages, that all of this comes to the fore. And just as a final slide, I suppose we can talk about technology, we can talk about industry, and in many respects we would love to be able to say that somebody is going to drive my car for me in 20 or 30 years' time, or we're going to have a robot that's going to clean the house when I'm gone to work, or something else. And that kind of innovation, that type of technology, that type of future thinking is built on concepts. And it's built on concepts that we have to absolutely hold to the core of rural Ireland. And those are place-based regeneration. This idea of locally rooted and flexible thinking. If it doesn't work in here, it might work here. If it doesn't work for us, move on and try something else. Resilience is absolutely paramount in rural areas. We have to be ready to adapt to change. If change comes in all of this new technology and innovation, we have to be able to adapt to it. When we think about regeneration and revitalisation, we often talk about bouncing back. I ask rural Ireland to bounce forward. Don't just bounce back to where you were before you regenerated your area. Bounce forward. Spatial justice is something that we really must think about as well. This idea of fair and equitable, I suppose, distribution of socially and valued resources for everybody, including rural Ireland. Just transition is something that here in the Midlands, I suppose, is paramount as well in your thinking. But we need to be able to assist communities to meet the green challenge. We need to help communities in doing that so they can make sure that the green challenge is met. Community capitals. All communities will thrive and strive if capitals are built on them. We often talk about social capital. Communities to networking. One of the biggest issues that we will have in rural areas into the future is a lack of networking. People have become distributed in rural areas and have become very much in on themselves and very much excluded from communities and societies. We must make sure, I suppose, that that doesn't happen. We must make sure that we have communities that are built on social capital, that are built on these kinds of social and political capitals that we have there. The multi-actor approach that comes through EIT Agri, people working together to find the answer. In the future, that is what we need. We cannot work in silos to find the answer for rural Ireland. Endogenous development, but neo-endogenous development. Neo-endogenous development is about looking outside of my community. What's outside there that could work for me? What's outside there that could actually enhance my community? And that's where we need to work as well. Geographic clustering. If one small area is doing well, let's look at the next area and see do they have something similar. Let's look at the area beside it. Let's bring communities, parishes, villages together and geographically cluster them in relation to industry, in relation to services, and in relation to working together. Governance is something, again, that's hugely important. Governed from the top is not the way we are going. Governed from small community areas is what we need to happen. And that's what's happening now. That's what's happening, and we need to make sure that that continues. And I'm going to finish off with the quote that I started. And I suppose the present is determined by our past actions, but most definitely the future is determined by our present. So what we see now are the trends that we will see into the future. We just need to capitalise on those trends that we have now. So thank you very much.
Fantastic. Maura, thank you very much. Absolutely a challenging presentation more than anything else. Everybody at every table in the room, I think, was looking at themselves there in terms of some of the challenges you were throwing forward. So brilliant to get the discussion and the debate going. And a couple of things immediately strike me in terms of our panel today, in terms of some of the questions that were asked by Maura at the very beginning about the jobs issue and the employment issue and about the ability of rural Ireland to create highly paid, well-qualified jobs. You know, that issue has come up a few times before. And indeed, I suppose, in general, about the way our community is structured and how we look after people, what we do. So I'm going to go to you, Larry O'Connell, first, the Director of the National Economic and Social Council we'll get you a mic. And I suppose firstly, Larry, just in a general sense, in terms of your role, the NASC, in a nutshell, I suppose your role is to see what we're going, where we're going as a society as we go beyond 2022, the next 30 years, and looking at tackling rural poverty and disadvantage. So I might ask, beginning by asking you, what are the trends telling us at the moment, and where are we likely to land in 2051 if we don't do some of the things that Maura has talked about this morning?
Thanks very much, Kieran. Well, to be honest, as I sat listening to Maura, I thought, well, what she said, I mean, that's a fantastic run over the terrain in terms of the trends coming down the track, and as you say, the challenges and the opportunities. My sense, and having listened to the conversation earlier, I think we're in really good shape in rural Ireland. I mean, I think if you look at the capability we have, even if you look on the food side, in 2020 we exported €14 billion worth of food. We're seen across the globe as a high quality, safe food. We have a fantastic reputation. We have 164,000 people working in the agri-food sector. So it's a really vibrant and central part of the Irish economy. But we are facing some headwinds. And if we look at it on the societal side, we look at it like 1 in 100 people in Ireland work over 70 hours a week. If you look in the agri-food sector, it's 1 in 5 are working over 70 hours. If you look at it, there's about 5% of people working in farming earn over 100,000. So it's a really challenging sector. We definitely face headwinds in the environmental side. When we look at emissions, we have a real strength here in terms of the carbon footprint of Irish dairy and Irish beef, but the trajectory of emissions is going the wrong way if we look at the pressure on water quality from agriculture. So there are headwinds, but the real, I suppose, sense I have here today is that the capacity to deal with those headwinds is there. But if I could say one thing then on it, for me the critical thing is that we need, it isn't just bottom up. So if I was to quibble a little bit, I would say it isn't bottom up governance and it's not from the top either. What we really need to do is to create conversations where we link the bottom with the top. So I would also take maybe a small issue with the presentation this morning, where the argument was made that we're not tackling the challenges. We're not putting in place strategies at the top to deal with the challenges in agriculture. I think we are. But where we need to do is to link it down to the creativity and the innovation we see happening at the ground level. And Maura's slide around the EIPs was fantastic, but also some of the presentations we see around the room today. So the energy is there at local level. The real challenge is to create these conversations to connect them. To be fair, I think Irish Rural Link have been one of the key bodies in linking up from the bottom up to national. That needs to continue. But from Nest's point of view, and I'll finish on this, one of the things we're trying to do is to create what we're calling a just transition conversation about agriculture. Because nobody likes change, and certainly nobody likes change to be done to them. So what we need to do is, I think we recognise in rural Ireland that we need to face these challenges. What we need to do now is to bring people on board to figure out together exactly how we're going to transition agriculture over the next 30 years or so.
It's thought-provoking. The role of migrants was mentioned by Maura. You remember when I asked you to come in on this as a member of the Municipal Council in Longford, and somebody who has proven themselves to be a bit of a trailblazer in terms of your work. I wonder if I could ask you, from your perspective, what do we need to make happen to make sure that Irish rural democracy keeps pace with the demographic changes? Over 200 different countries, I think, were mentioned in the presentation this morning. What do we need to do?
Thank you very much, Kieran. And what needs to be done is something like this: have inclusion in panels, have inclusion in events, because that is what being modeled in the presentation, and have solution. So if I talk about my story, for example, since I moved to to integrate in the community, to get involved in terms of school. I got on the school board to understand the Irish culture so that I can help my children to integrate. But my children so I have very engaged in GAA. I'm actually the integration officer for Lumpur Slashes GAA, so very involved in that in the community, because I see the value of learning culture, and it's also an opportunity to educate the Irish natives of my culture. Symbiotic existence where we maximise the opportunity of, having the best of both cultures, because it it is an inclusive society. In the next 10 years, the only thing I will add to Maura's fantastic presentation is that in the next 10 years we'll have more mixed-race children. So it also drives the need even more for integration, for diversity and inclusion to be foremost in every organization, in every conversation. Even in our education system, I think that's one place that's lacking as well. And that is another area where we can really move forward firmly in the future in terms of rural Ireland to make our education system more inclusive. My 12-year-old made a remark that she's now in first year in secondary school and she's never been taught by a black teacher. So even the children are making these observations. And I want my children to see a representative society when they get into the labour market, that they won't have these challenges that I had to face, and I had to dig deep and be resilient because I know the future I want to achieve for myself. And I'm thankful to the local community for embracing me as well and supporting me in all of my endeavours. And it's no mean feat to be a local councillor in a rural community as well. And being elected Mayor of Longford Municipal District was a huge moment for me, for my family, for migrants in Longford, and for the Irish people as well, because the international community took note. And Ireland was firmly on the map for positive reasons, and one more positive reason. And I think it is very important for us to make individual effort to speak to migrants around us, because I think the development is very much individual as much as it is collective. And one thing I also noticed in my role as a public representative is I think we have got away a bit from critical thinking, and that is something that needs to be brought back into our consciousness as well, because I hear sometimes people talking about the issues, and what I see absent is that they don't realize that they have the solutions and they're part of the solution, and it's just about getting it out of them to make them see that they can solve some of their problems. And that is another way to move forward firmly in rural Ireland as well, being empowered. And we have lots of migrants, we 200 migrants, people from migrant communities are in Ireland, 200 different nationals are in Ireland, and a huge number of those are in rural Ireland. And as long as we have pride of place, as long as we see ourselves represented in local authorities, in companies, in communities, we will definitely be part of the improvement. I think I see my friend there at the back of the room that we met today, and they are doing a research program, and we were just commenting on the absence of more migrants in these spaces, talking about these changes. And it is I suppose work to do amongst ourselves to really get more migrants involved in rural aspects, in farming and in the education. Again, that's another thing that needs to be encouraged in primary and secondary education. I don't think I've heard my children talk about farming or agriculture, apart from remarking that their friends are working on farms and making a bit of money to spend. And that's the only, I suppose, the only attraction for them. But I think it's something I remember going through secondary school, we had agriculture very much in the curriculum, and we worked on farms, and we had, I suppose, an appreciation of farming, of growing our crops. And I do have a few friends who have farms in their back gardens, and these are the conversations we need to be having with more migrants, so they feel part of the community. I know I talk about it up here at the moment.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm involved in a project myself. I'm involved in a project myself at the moment where 3 members of the Syrian community are starting a social farming exercise week after next, going out to farm every day for 8 weeks. So I know exactly what you're speaking about. More mention some of the things we have to do, I suppose, to improve the value of what we have in the countryside, and that includes tourism, I suppose, in many respects. The product we have turning some of our natural resources into major pluses for living in the country, for working in the country. Kate Flood is here from the School of Geography in NUI Galway. Kate, I want to ask you about this issue of not bog, not turf, but maybe peatlands, all right? Because as we move away from these traditional forms of work on the peats, maybe perhaps you could talk to us about what are the potential new economics that peatlands can offer and how they're related to environmental and social well-being. How big an opportunity is out there, Kate?
Yeah, I think it's huge. I'm representing the Community Wetlands Forum today here as well, and we started almost 10 years ago in 2013, 2014. It was very much a grassroots, bottom-up movement, but also very much a multi-actor approach, because we have ecologists from NPWS, we have lots of different kind of representatives from all sorts of organisations, and I suppose the quality of life thing I'd really pick up on, because in terms of, I've heard recently economics is too important to leave to economists, we all should be getting involved in these kind of things, and really there's this movement, especially in a lot of the smaller countries like New Zealand and Iceland and Scotland. It's actually called the Wellbeing Alliance, and I think, like what Conor was saying this morning about rural Ireland, we should be thinking in terms of economies and rather than the economy, the diverse economies, because there's all sorts of exchanges and labour that is done in rural Ireland, or Ireland that is not paid. A lot of volunteer work. Really, the Community Wetlands Forum was, entirely kind of volunteers to start with, and we moved into a paid member of staff, and I would love to see that happening more, where we have 25 community groups now. I'd say every single one of them could employ somebody, and with all the fundraising they do, meetings, I'm sure lots of people here know all about the kind of work that's involved, and it's kind of feeding into that bigger thing about the indicators of progress, and what kind of growth do we want to see. So we have used GDP as an indicator for progress for too long, really, because a lot of industries are not necessarily contributing to people's communities or to social and environmental well-being. If you look at data centres, and again, maybe we shouldn't go there, but just that's an example, I suppose. And what's happening at the ground level, at peatlands, it's very regenerative. It's actually, some of it is restoring the bogs, re-wetting them so that they can capture carbon, and there are a lot of different, I suppose, research projects going on at the moment about carbon farming and stagnant farming, and it's just opening our eyes to what's out there as well at a European level. I'll just give you one example from the Greifswald Meyer Centre in Germany, and they are looking at pluviculture, which is basically agriculture on wetlands, but it's kind of a bit anathema to what we've been used to. We're used to draining land in Ireland, and we're being asked now to re-wet it. But pluviculture is one of the things they did was growing a reed called typha, and if alongside that you have the policy. So the policy says, right, it's actually a building material, it's an insulator. So 2% of every house has to have this typha in it. So you're creating a market essentially. So I think communities are, when you talk about innovation, I've seen so much innovation with, we have Clarabog here. I better give them a mention, shout out. They've been working with the Living Bog project, and Brian tells me that the boardwalk there is, constantly in use there, and it's a real, I suppose, that physical well-being, mental well-being, the idea of, kind of sustainable leisure time almost that you're doing. Leisure isn't just, relaxing, watching Netflix. You can actually get out there, get rid of some rhododendron that's growing on the bog, or, there's just so many things that these communities are doing. Abbeyleaf Bog is, making charcoal and from the rhododendron and getting artists involved.
So, creative industries, so I think when we think about industry, that word is smoky chimneys and, maybe technology, but you have all of those kind of different elements involved. So I'll leave it there, maybe. And
thanks, Amelia. Thank you, Amelia. Yes, I mean, Maura started this. I was thinking about how diverse our conversation has been since we started. The next two issues that we're going to hear about are rural transport and electricity. Alan, on the end there, Local Link is obviously playing an important part in keeping people in rural Ireland and keeping them connected and able to live there. So I might ask you, Alan, where is Irish rural transport heading next?
Thank you, Kieran. Good afternoon, everybody. Look, I think we're definitely knocking on the door of possibly a very, very exciting time for the delivery of public transport in rural areas. And I think even our terminology has changed in recent years, where we have gone from being the rural transport programme to now talking about the provision of public transport in rural areas. Connecting Ireland programme, which was launched I think in October of last year by the Minister, is the biggest advancement in relation to funding for the provision of public transport in rural areas in the history of the state. But I think there are elements of this expansion that we need to ensure we consider the road that we take. And while the expansion of scheduled services, as we would recognise them having bus stops and recognisable places for people to get on and off, we have to be mindful of, if a person isn't within accessibility of that stop, how useful is that service for them? And I think, again, in considering Maura's presentation, we consider our past to try and take our steps to the future. And traditionally and historically, probably the biggest success story that we have been able to associate to rural transport in the 20 years is the development of demand-responsive services, where people could be picked up from their homes and dropped back. So demand-responsive transport eradicates a lot of complications that there are around the scheduling and planning of public transport. Specifically, you don't have the major complication of that last mile. So how do people get to the bus stop? If people don't have to go there and the bus comes to them, that eradicates that issue. But I think we do have to recognise that the vast majority of people who would have benefited at that time from rural transport services and continue to benefit today were probably, generally women of my mother's generation who never drove a car, and maybe the man of the house, was lost. A dependency was formed on neighbours or friends, and that really was the key objective of the rural transport programme at that time, is how did government go about reducing that dependency on neighbours or friends and give people some independence in regard to continuing to go about their own business. And I think when we think now about connecting Ireland, we need to set the objective of trying to reduce the dependency on second and third cars in rural households, because that's a dependency probably as dangerous as cocaine or anything else that people might find dependencies on from an environmental perspective. And I think that is the journey that we need to now ensure that we endeavour on. How do we create version 2 of demand responsive transport, where we may have a version that allows us to ensure that people can still connect into the mainline services that are now going to be expanded through the Connecting Ireland programme. So I think, again, to just sort of take from Maura's presentation, what are the important lessons that we've been fortunate enough to teach ourselves over the last 20 years, and how do we ensure that they help us on the road for the next 20?
So I mentioned electricity. Of course, it is crucial to the development of any area, particularly rural areas. Mark Foley is here, Group Chief Executive of EirGrid. You recently published your Shaping Our Electricity Future Roadmap. Mark, can you tell us, I suppose, how rural communities will be involved in this in terms of shaping the Ireland's electricity future from your perspective?
Thank you, Kieran, and good morning to everybody, and congratulations to Rural Link on your fantastic 30 years of fantastic service to rural Ireland. can I just be a little bit provocative? Imagine if your electricity service was like your broadband service. Would you accept that? I think not. We are used to electricity as being 100% reliable, always there at the flick of a switch. It's the backbone of our economy, it's the backbone of the way we live, it's the backbone of how we're entertained, etc. And we've set that standard, and I think that's a standard, I suppose, rightfully, we're entitled to, but equally we should understand the privilege that goes with that. Secondly, 2007, the Green Party Green Coalition said we'll have 40% of all of our power from renewables by 2020, and most people thought they were out of their mind. They thought this was fantasy stuff, green ambition, it will never happen. And on the 31st of December 2020, Ireland achieved over 40% all of its electricity from green sources. Back. We are now on a journey to 70%, and now 80% as articulated in the Climate Action Plan. That is bigger than rural electrification. That is seismic in terms of what we have to do in terms of changing the electricity system such that every electron in 2030 is green, or 80% I should say. But the physics are practically overcome. The engineering is definitely manageable. The ICT, or the software, is definitely manageable. The challenge is actually, can we bring people with us? It's not about engineering, it's about social acceptance. It's about getting society, rural and urban, to come on the journey and accept what goes with delivering that journey. EirGrid's Shaping Our Electricity Future, which we launched in November, in COP26, it gives us that roadmap. And it has two fundamental principles attached to it. One is you can't continue the journey on a developer-led basis, which is we will put things where developers want to put them. We've said, no, you've got to plan it better. You've got to put demand where it's appropriate, and you've got to put generation where it's appropriate and match the two. We don't apologise for that, but it's a better plan, it's more executable, it's less impacting, and it's lower cost. And secondly, the other component of EirGrid's plan is we must engage with communities and get them on board early in terms of the solutions. Not go with the solution, but go with the problem. Talk to them, engage with them, make them part of the solution, allow their voice to be heard, and make them beneficiaries in terms of the ultimate result. That's the challenge that's in front of us. I don't have the engineering, I don't have the physics. If we don't get people on board, we will fail. And I think that's the great challenge. I ask you, read our document and get behind it. I'll finish with an anecdote. I live in rural Ireland, so this part is not a CEO, this is as a citizen. I live in Newcastle in County Wicklow, small estate, 13 houses, about a kilometre and a half from the sea. This evening I will walk down to the sea with my two new rescue dogs who won't walk, so I put them in a buggy, which my wife bought, which is quite hilarious, and all the neighbours laugh. I'm used to this incredible vista and this beautiful horizon from Greystones to Wexford, which I look at every evening when I walk. I have to give that up for the ambition for 2030. There's an offshore wind farm planned by a company. And one of the biggest personal challenges, or citizen challenges, I have in the next 2 years is to convince my other 12 neighbours this is good. This is right for Ireland. I have 3 sons and 2 grandchildren. We have to give up this vista. And by the way, it's not bad. For the good of our country and for the good of the next generation. One of my neighbours came to me Monday night and said, would you sign an objection to 5 more bungalows close to where we live? 5 bungalows. Just put that in context. I live in a 13-house estate, and some the neighbours want to reject the 5 bungalows. For God's sake, we have to wake up and engage, become educated, and accept what's coming down the tracks. Otherwise, we're going to fail. So, the next number of years are actually about education, information, conversations, and getting people behind the vision for the future. Airfield Shaping Our Electricity Future is a roadmap that I believe is the right solution. And please, if you hear about it or you haven't, read it and please support it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a big panel, and I'm sure you're ready with your questions. We're going to come to you very shortly, but with one final speaker, and I want to hear from Fintan O'Brien, the Assistant Secretary General with the Department of Rural Development, and he's involved in the regional affairs there. So Fintan, I suppose all these issues, many of these issues will go back to policy. So I'm going to ask you, what's the general long-term direction of Irish government rural policy? We heard a bit this morning from the Minister about new schemes such as acquisition of derelict buildings or reusing old banks and things in the town. But you're surrounded by rural organisations here today. Fintan, perhaps you talk to maybe, if you could, about the long term. What's coming down the line?
Okay, thanks, Kieran. And I suppose I've been intently listening through today's event with that kind of focus in mind. You know, what does all this mean? Does this fit in with the way we think about rural development policy? And I suppose, as a few people have mentioned, we do have a national policy. It is a 5-year policy, our rural future, and within that, I think importantly, it does set out what the government's vision is for rural Ireland. I'm just going to read it to you very quickly. It is one sentence, but there is quite a lot in it. So what it says is, the government's vision is for a thriving rural Ireland, which is integral to our national economic, social, cultural, environmental well-being and development, which is built on the interdependence of urban and rural areas, and which recognises the centrality of people, the importance of vibrant and lived in rural places, and the potential to create quality jobs and sustain our shared environment. So, sadly, I carry that page around quite a bit from meeting to meeting because there's a lot in that sentence, and I'm looking down at William there. He probably spent a lot of time getting that sentence right. I would imagine a lot of people fed into that. But listening today, that to me does seem to pick up a lot of what people were talking about today, and a lot of those themes and a lot of those ideas that people were talking about. So, while it's all very well to have a high level of vision, I suppose, and I think Maura said this, how do you actually just go and get it done? You have to get things done. So what does that mean for us in terms of rural development policy? And we have a system set up there. It's important to say that our rural future isn't saying that it's going to deliver that vision today or tomorrow. It's a stepping stone towards that long-term vision. It does include a set of 150 measures. Importantly, they are right across the sector. They are right across government. This isn't something that is dealt with by a small group of people in an office in Dublin. This is all across the sector, so that's really important. But running under and through all those measures and all those actions and all that implementation in the next couple of years is a couple of really important themes. And again, I've been jotting them down as we went through today's discussion, because I think a lot of them tally with the way this policy has been developed, and a lot of the thought process and a lot of discussions like these that went into that policy and that long-term ambition for rural Ireland. Things like the idea that this idea that there are unique parts of rural Ireland, it's not all the same. Absolutely one size fits all will not get the job done. There is no such thing as a panacea or a one size fits all that gets it all done. Really important, and a lot of work going on there at the moment. The idea of engagement, there's been a lot of talk about bottom or top. I do like the mention of that it's not bottom or top. There's that constant engagement, and again, things like today are important in that. That engagement with communities, with stakeholders, with people with a vested interest was central to developing the policy before my time. But it's also going to be central to implementing the policy. And I think the Minister mentioned this. The consultation isn't over, the engagement isn't over. There's things happening on the ground that we need to be aware of and we need to be talking about. That puts into, I suppose, this idea that the vision, long-term direction has to be flexible. New things will come up, new challenges and new opportunities. It has to be a living policy. It can't be something that's, because it says 2021 to 25, it can't just stay on the shelves and not change over that period. One of the things as well that's kind of central to where we see that long-term direction is the idea that rural and urban, it's not one or the other, one versus the other, there's an interdependence between them. And that has to be the way. And if you go back to that sentence there, that very definitively puts rural development into context of the national, social, economic, environmental well-being. It's a national thing, it's not one or the other. And sometimes you hear that the discussion may be heading towards the one versus the other. I think it's really important to pull back that interdependence between urban and rural. I suppose finally, one of the final themes that we see as central to our rural future is this focus on the people and the place. It's about the people that live in rural Ireland, and it's about the places that they want to live in. It's very easy to talk in high-level terms and highfalutin language, but that's what it's about. It's about people and places, and what make up the variety of rural Ireland. So, what does all that mean? How do we see that going over the period? We haven't set really hard targets, and I think that's a good thing. But what it does envisage is things like reduced income disparity between the regions, more people living and working in rural Ireland, more people employed and self-employed, greater connectivity, all these kind of things. And for me, that just reflects back on what type of things we were discussing today. It's all very well to have a vision, it's all very well to have, very technical language. It's about these things that make a difference in people's day-to-day lives. Those that have a high-level outcomes, that's what we're trying to improve, and that's what is absolutely all the actors involved, all the people here today are trying to improve them. It's not something that's been done in an office in Dublin. It's about engaging with those communities, people involved in rural development, in rural areas, building on that talent, that engagement and that enthusiasm, and that's where we're trying to head. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I did tell you at the beginning it would be very, very different to part one, and it was. We spoke about a lot of traditional features of rural life in part one. We spoke about an awful lot of different, new, advancing life in part two. But you're going to have your chance now to put your questions to the panel. I think because the time will have one round, so we'll go on to as many as I can, and we'll take them all, and we get the panel to come back and reply with a bit more brevity as we come back. Go ahead and identify yourself, please, when you start. Thank you.
Ivan Phillips, the Atlantic Technological University in Galway. I want to compliment Maura first of all on her presentation. It was excellent. And in her presentation, she talked about innovation. She talked about new thinking and new ideas. I would like Maura, Maura, and also the panel. Why can we not have a new vision for our post office network? I haven't heard the words post offices mentioned here today. Our rural post offices are an important part of our rural society. And sadly, we've lost many of these over the years. And the impact of a closure of a rural post office is huge. And I would be advocating over the next 30 years that we'd have community ownership of our post office network. And I'll give you an example. In the United Kingdom, when David Cameron was British Prime Minister, think about it, a Tory party supported the development of 500 community-owned post offices. We need to stop this rot in rural Ireland. We need to stop the closure of rural post offices. And we need to start thinking outside the box. We need new thinking. And I would be arguing strongly that we need community ownership of post offices. We've done it with our credit unions. Why not a post office network? Thank you.
Cheers, Ivan. Thank you. Next.
Good afternoon. Catherine O'Donnell here from Forest Owners Club. I very much endorse the remarks there of the last gentleman. I come from that rural post office which was closed down, and it was the centre, it was the hub of every kind of activity, from solving the kids' school problems to providing that old age pension of the stamp that was needed. And yes, while innovation and change must be welcomed, and there's a huge, huge role, there's a huge, I suppose, wealth of knowledge in rural Ireland which is untapped, and we have not embraced that circular economy, that circular aspect of information and education that needs a financial input, which it's not getting because we're not being listened to. My colleague here, Michael, this morning spoke about sort of forestry industry and how it hadn't got sort of mentioned here this morning. Mr. McDonough sort of addressed it in his response, but it was clear, sort of, to me, the level of sort of lack of information there is, and the lack of
innovation that there is around the whole aspect of forestry and the integration of forestry in our daily lives, from the building of homes to the seats we sit on. And I suppose my words here this morning are, in leaving, that there are still pieces of this rural economy and social network of rural Ireland, of that jigsaw missing. And let's attack it, and let's put action into it, but let's get around to sort of all the country. I come from an area called Ballyham. We had 20,000 went through the village for a jazz festival last weekend. We hold a festival of some kind, shape or description every month of the year, and we have no problem of getting people into the locality. On top of that, can I say that we have every shop in the village occupied, and we have a new restaurant opening there, in another new restaurant. There are 4 there already, opening in the next couple of weeks. But we have a problem, a huge problem daily, in hanging on to the post office in which we have, and that post office, it's our bank, it's our hub, it's our centre for everything. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next question.
I'm Marie Flynn from Mayo North Tourism. We're based in Ballina in County Mayo. Thank you to Maura for an excellent presentation, and to all the speakers. There's been a lot of food for thought here today. I work in the community development sector, specifically in tourism development, and what we see on the ground, the key challenge for us is really a lack of human resource to develop and to deliver projects. And sometimes I wonder, working in that sector, whether we're just so accustomed to it. There is so much work to be done. We could all be working 60, 70, 80 hours a week, and I think we forget to question it sometimes. Larry talked about linking the top to the bottom there. Kate talked about the volume of work that's involved in community and projects. And Fintan, you talked about having that vision at the top, and how do we actually make it happen? We're seeing at the moment that there is an abundance of funding out there for projects. And there's a huge appetite on the ground to deliver projects that will create sustainable economic development within communities and create employment, but the capacity just isn't there to deliver them. We're in a peripheral area, we're over-reliant on volunteers, we're sparsely populated, and we're very much seeing a need for more human resource to assist communities to deliver these projects, to empower them to take ownership of them, and to support them throughout the lifespan of those projects. And I'm just wondering, Fintan, if there is a plan to write that into policy, and what are your thoughts on that?
Thank you. We'll go back to Fintan in a moment. The other lady is back.
Hello. It's very interesting that I'm actually following that last speaker, because I'm from the National Water Forum, and we're a stakeholder body made up of different organisations with an interest in water. And the Irish Rural Link is a member of that forum. George here beside me sits on as a member. So as Conor Skehan said earlier, there are going to be river-based management plans developed across a new national river-based management plan is currently being developed. And as part of that, there is a plan to develop 46 catchment plans. And in our policy submission from the forum, we recommended that there should be public participation in the development of those catchment plans. And the idea is that the communities will be engaged with to find solutions for not only water, but for nature, climate, and for our local communities. When you engage with communities, the idea is that you engage with everybody. That is business, tourism, all of these different organisations. Everybody in the community has an opportunity to contribute to how they want their catchment and rivers and the objectives that we have to meet under all of our EU policies, how we can deliver that as a community. As part of our submission as well, we said that there needed to be the structures put in place to support communities to deliver actions. Leader companies have lots of funding for projects for water, biodiversity and climate, but it's very difficult for volunteers and communities to deliver on large projects. They need the support structures from the local authority, from the different agencies responsible in these areas to deliver those projects. So the communities need to work with the government departments and agencies to deliver projects on the ground. But we have said that those structures need to be put in place. So we're in negotiations with the department to deliver the structures that the communities need to support action on the ground. So there is a missing link there, and it's about getting that addressed.
Thank you very much. Conscious we're coming towards the end, I want to hear from some of the panel, not them all, but you had to listen to a lot in the last hour, so I'm going to get 2 more questions off the floor, please.
Good afternoon. My name is Veronica Barrett, and my colleague is here with me, Patrick, from RHS Home Care. Kieran would be aware of us, and so would Dr. Farrell, and maybe a number of other people here. We are a home care company based in Roscommon, covering 3 counties. But one of the problems we face now in Ireland, in the 3 counties we operate in, is recruiting staff. And I know that Pat McDonough touched on the subject as well. And it's becoming a real problem now, because the majority of older people, I've never, in fact, in my 22 years working for RHS, I've never met one person that wanted to go into full-time care in a nursing home. But the government seem to encourage that, in that they are delivering the Fair Deal scheme for that purpose alone, but not for people to remain at home in their communities and in their own homes where they should be. And now we see, as that speaker said earlier, post offices closing, banks, the Ballygar branch of Bank of Ireland is gone. There's 2 post offices in my vicinity closed, and very soon Ulster Bank will be gone out of the country in total. And I don't know, maybe I'm on a different track to everybody else, but I do not see this as progression. And I think we should be given every opportunity to people to remain at home in their own homes, and encouraging them to do so, because that way they can become part of their communities. And you know, I'm finished with this. I remember years ago looking at a film called The Jazz Singer. You might all have heard of it. Neil Diamond was in it. And his father said to him, "How do you know where you're going if you don't know where you've come from?" And I think that should be the mantra for us going forward.
Thank you very much.
Kieran, provincial, an excellent job. But I take a slightly different turn and from what we had all day today. I grew up in rural Ireland, and still in rural Ireland. John Marker, and graduated the ICMC, and now representing Ballyhowler Development and the Board of Irish Holding. I have watched the stop-start go of Ireland since the 70s. There was the recession in the 80s, recession in the 90s, and the mother and father of the recession in the 90s, in the banks and the country collapsed. We, as a country, are going nowhere unless you stabilise the economy of this country. We had a rainy day fund, which was an asset when the pandemic broke out. It wasn't a big enough fund, firstly, but we were. And I would urge, right there, the economic side of things, to reinvent that rainy day fund. Because Merriam's and Allen's rural link, Amara's, Galway University will all be shock funded if we hit another recession, if we do not have a rainy day fund, so as we can have a level playing field year on year. We won't have ups and downs, that's it. But after what's after happening in Ukraine and what's happening across the world, we may not be 100 miles from a bit of blip, but the blip might be downwards. We never had more people employed in the country, something over in excess of 2 million. The taxes are there. We should get that fund together now, in place, so as to make sure that all those services. But I actually walked down here last night to the quays of the pier where the gates was. I was talking to the guy there that was responsible for opening the lock. I said, during the boom, there was 12 cruise boats based here in that zone. I'm sure the world is still around. The fabulous, you like dream boats, they're living it, it's that fabulous. But when the recession came, 11 of them disappeared. We do not want that to happen again. We need to get our act together.
Thank you very much. Good point as well. We've got 5 minutes left, so I'm not going to ask all the panel to reply. We'll be here till 10 to 6, but I'm going to offer everybody an opportunity to come in, so to speak, but I want to hear from the panel first, and I'm going to bring in Fintan firstly. The 2 of your questions seem to be on this issue of resources backup for rural development. 2 of the questions there. And unless I'm mistaken, Fintan, I did hear something recently about a new pilot scheme for towns. And I heard something about recruiting an officer for the town. Is that? I think that's what they want. They want it for counties as well as towns, perhaps. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Kieran. And look, there's a whole topper of interesting things that were said there. I was taking copious notes on this idea of innovation. Before I get to that resource issue, I won't take too much of your time. Absolutely agree with that. And there was a bit of a class in the past when more flashed up the agri slide there. It's been a long time since I've been involved in that. But that is about bringing people together locally, not the top down and saying, this is the solution, this is the rules. Getting people together locally and saying, this is the problem we see, and this is our solution. That's the innovation that really drives this whole process forward. There was mention of post offices and banks. Look, that's been a long-standing issue. I agree that probably some creative thinking required around that, around diversifying services. There has been a lot of discussion on that. I would say there's a lot of investment around both community services and homes within towns through various schemes and converting old guard stations, post offices, banks, whatever it is. There's a lot of that going on. That idea of a central hub, a community hub within rural areas is hugely important. We can speak directly to the idea about the resources. So yeah, there is a lot of funding streams out there. Very conscious that, so it's a different model to what I was used to say in my previous roles in terms of how we fund these schemes. It's very much dependent on the people locally coming together, driving those ideas, coming up with proposals. They know best what is needed. I actually had this discussion with the chief executives of a local authority recently. Effectively, what those schemes are pots of money until someone says, this is what we're going to do with it. And that is important, that is resourced. So there's lots of discussions around the system about how much we're asking of local authorities and various people to do. But there are models out there, as mentioned, one of those is Town Centre First. So that was really very much based on this idea of bringing everyone together, coming together. I can't tell you what the master plan for your town is, you need to tell us. So obviously that's a difficult thing to do. There is huge enthusiasm out there for it. But one of the things we're doing is putting in place town regeneration officers in every local authority area. Someone who's going to be, I suppose, the folk for that, bringing the people together, put a bit of, I suppose, shape on those ideas and take all that in. So that model is out there, we have rural recreation officers as well, that kind of thing. So absolutely I agree, it's a challenge. It is something we're aware of. But yes, there is a lot of funding streams out there, and I go around the country quite a lot with the minister, and she's always saying the streams are out there, funding come to us with your ideas. So yeah, glad to hear that people are aware of them. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Larry, you got name checked there with regard to our concerns, and we'll hear more. But I mean, before we left the room, at McDonough, I asked him a question on this side of the hall about a local hotel he was due to build at Longford, and was he going to go ahead with it? And he said the answer is not in the present climate, but the cost, the inflation within the construction sector. And he said he'd have concerns about the big R word, recession. So what can you do to make this man go home and sleep well tonight, that we're going to plan for a rainy day in the future?
Well, thanks, Kieran. Yeah, well, I mean, I suppose what I would say to you is, I mean, we had a rainy day fund, we hit the pandemic, and it was nowhere near enough to deal with the problem. So I would say the key thing is to invest in our economy, invest in the infrastructure. So the finance will get you so far when you hit, but you don't know the scale of the crisis. So I think we have to invest in education more heavily. We have to invest in infrastructure and broadband much. And I think we have to balance that with being overly cautious, saying we'll put all this money in the bank when the crisis hits. That would just be my view.
Maura, do you want to come on that?
Yeah.
You started all this debate, Maura.
No, just a couple of things maybe that I want to kind of allude to. I think post offices are, they're often lumped in with some of the other things that are declining in rural Ireland. And I think I listened to a television programme there going back a few years ago when there was the post office mistress was interviewed, and she said, well, I have to close it down because there's nobody coming into it. So she wasn't looking for people 100 miles away to come into it. She was looking for the locals to come into it. And they weren't coming into it. But the other day, a son of mine said, well, I'm going to get a current account in the post office. And I kind of did a double take, and I went, great. Now we know that, these areas, these groups, these organisations, there has to be innovative kind of thinking as well. The day is gone when the local person went into the local shop because the owner of the shop was going to see him. That day is gone. Young people don't care whether the owner of the shop sees them or not. They go in because they want something in there. And if it's not there, then they're not going to go in. So when we talk about post offices and we talk about these rural industries that were there in the past, they will only survive if they're going to provide something that people need. And that is the hard fact of the truth. And young people, that's the way they think. And if I can get it online or get it somewhere else, that's where I will do it. But if the post office provides a service for them, they will use it. And that's where the thinking needs to be innovative, it needs to be new, and it needs to be diverse. One other thing, definitely, in relation to, I suppose, this idea of volunteerism. I was involved in the CEDRA Commission going back a number of years ago, where the one thing I thought about at the time, most definitely, I got to travel to Galway every day. And I spent, pre-pandemic, whichever, I spent 2 hours in my car getting in and out to Galway every day. Those are my 2 hours of volunteerism. That's my volunteerism gone. There's many, many people like me across the country, and the same things happen where there's 2 people working in the house. So their volunteerism hours are reduced rapidly, and we need paid people in order to take on those roles in community, or else really community, that kind of work really needs to come from paid people as well. And we have those people, we're qualifying those people within our universities, we need to give them those jobs as well.
Thank you very much for that. I'm told my time is up, but the MC must get questions answered. The lady asked from Wisconsin Home Care Services about recruitment, I think was the question. How can she recruit? What can we do? I'll give it to anybody on the panel who wants to come forward with this. What can she do? What can you do to assist her in ensuring that we can recruit people for these jobs that she has and she can't get anybody to work in at the moment? You're in.
Yeah, I can answer that simply. As a migrant coming to Ireland, I had achieved third level education before coming here. Sadly, my educational qualification was not recognised in Ireland. That is one simple way of solving that problem. There are a lot of educated migrants that their third level qualifications are not recognised. So there are a lot of people working in sectors where they're qualified in other sectors. Again, we're talking about the inequalities in communities. Another thing that I think from my position of a public rep, there's a lot of decision making at central level that need to be, and filtering that down to local authorities, giving local authorities more power will go a long way to reducing those inequalities that we see in some parts of rural Ireland as well. So recognising the qualifications of migrants and giving them and empowering them. And we see with the reaction from the people of Ukraine, because it was a very, very real conflict that happened very close to us, and the same conflict that a lot of migrants are experiencing. But because I think we were far removed from it in Ireland, we didn't really understand the enormity of the conflict, of the issues that people are experiencing, people are fleeing from. And Ukraine kind of made us wake up to the reality of what happens to people when they have to flee from their communities through no fault of theirs. And we see how the community has, woken up and gotten involved. And again, in the way we reacted and in the way we all worked together to come out of COVID, it takes absolutely everybody in the community to work together if we want to achieve that future of rural Ireland in 2051 or in the next 30 years. We need to absolutely appreciate the qualification and the presence of migrants, the presence of people in the community. And again, we are all part of the solution. And as individuals, we need to look into ourselves and see how we can contribute. In addition to highlighting problems, we need to be part of the solutions as well. So let's come up with solutions also, and hopefully, collectively we can bounce forward, like Dr. Mara has said, which is a phrase I'm going to be using from today and into the future that we deserve. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think in fairness to RHS, I think when Roscommon Leader Partnership held an employment fair with some of the people from Ukraine recently, you were there, and you had just Dan, so she's practicing what you're preaching. Ladies and gentlemen, apologies, that's where we're going to leave it. We're well over time, but at this stage, before we come to a conclusion, just one moment. Just one moment.
If that was an auctioneer, you'd lose the license. You wouldn't come.
Thank you very much. My job is to try and get everybody in.
Public meeting.
and make sure everybody gets a chance to ask a question. So I'd like to thank the panel today for starters. My thanks in particular to Jeremy, to Fintan, to Larry, to Kate, to Alan, and to Mark. And thank you very much for your contribution. Put your hands together, please.
Yeah, good to see you too, Mark.
The teachers event I thought was very good.
It's very good now, yeah.
I'm sure we have questions this evening. We could continue to ask them. We'll be here at the start. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like at this point in particular to welcome Ms. Tara Farr, the chairperson of Irish Rural, back to the stage to close our
in the room. I think people are
and conclude today's event.
Okay.
It helps that he's so passionate about that project. It's great. Yeah. Did we stay or go? We have to stay for a minute.
Thank you, Kieran. I am the only thing now that's standing between you and lunch, so I keep this very, very quick. But I do want to thank all of you for turning out in such great numbers today. I think it's been a great, great celebration of 30 years, and we've gone over some of the challenges, we've also gone over some of the proposed solutions, and we might not always agree on everything. But I think one thing we can agree with is our shared passion for our rural communities. I think that's really, really important, and that has come out in spades today. I do want to thank Minister Heather Humphreys for opening the conference this morning. Definitely want to thank our COVID champions who provided such a wonderful service over the last couple of years, and a fantastic model run by IRL and the Wheel. I do want to thank our two panels for setting the scene for us, for really kick-starting the great debates and discussions we've had this morning, and give us an awful lot of food for thought. And particular thanks to Conor and Maura for their really insightful presentations. Our excellent MC, Kieran.
Yeah.
And you really did leave no question unanswered, so that's great job done. And we all know that, I mean, it's great to be back in a room. It's great to be back in a room with people and not looking at each other over a screen. But these events do not happen by accident. There's a huge amount of work that goes into them. And I do want to pay tribute to Seamus Boland, CEO, and the entire IRL team for putting on a really, really wonderful, vibrant event. And it's not just about today, it's a reflection of the work of the last 30 years. We're really blessed with the calibre of the leadership that we have in Seamus and the team. So I think a special round of applause for them. And finally, just to say, I know a lot of people that are here are members. If you're not a member of IRL, this is the sell bit now, do seek out some of the members of the team today. Think about joining up. We in Longford Women's Link, we're very proud members of IRL, and it's been a fantastic experience for us, so it is well worth the very small investment in membership. So we have a save the date for coming back in 2051. I plan to be long retired in a village in the Mediterranean somewhere, but you're all welcome back here in 30 years' time. And lunch is served in the restaurant across the hall, and thank you very much.
Well done, Maura. Super.
Thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed lunch. Just one quick message before you go. You've all been locked away for a long time. You're out now. I hope you all make the most of it. And I'd ask you not to apply the rule, the 3 Ds rule, in the coming weeks. You know the 3 Ds rule, which has caused a problem for all of us in community development and rural development. The chairperson who tells us he will or she will dictate, delegate. What's the third one? Disappear, usually. So I don't want you to do that at all. I'd like to see you back on the big day in 2051 or someone representing your community. I thank you for your attention today and you for your courtesy. Thank you very much.